Hello friends, this is Otz, according to a WhatsApp that you got forwarded from Grandma. And today, we're going to talk about every killer in Dead by Daylight. We'll discuss their strengths, evaluate their weaknesses, and ultimately compare them and try to place them on a tier list, which is very hard, but we'll try. All of this for the upcoming 5.30 patch, which is going to introduce boon perks, new perks, rework killers, rework perks. It's going to shake things up a lot, so we're going to try to predict how killers will fare in this new environment. It's not easy, but I will try to give you my conditions and my rules so that we see eye to eye and we're on the same page. As I said, this is for the upcoming 5.30 patch, and I'm assuming that you're playing on PC. PC has some innate advantages compared to console. There are also other external advantages, such as being able to use stretch resolution to see better, in-game filters, audio enhancement software. I'm going to assume that you're running none of that for the sake of consistency. But that doesn't mean that your opponents will not use those advantages. So we will keep in mind that some of the survivors that you'll play against will have access to these things. Now that we understand how the MMR system works and how simple and binary it is, it's just about kills, that's going to be our criteria to rank the killers. They will not be ranked on how many blood points they get, on how much they level up on the emblem system, or how pretty their cosmetics are. We're only going to rank them on their ability to consistently win, which is 3 or 4 kills in my book. And how they get these kills doesn't matter. It's only the results that matter. This is not a tournament or a staged event tier list. This is a natural public match tier list, which means that you don't know what you're going to go up against, at least in advance. You could go to any and all maps. You have access to any and all perks without restrictions. And of course, all of the add-ons for each killer are on the table. We will be assuming that you're very good at each killer. You play them to a reasonably high degree, very well, within human limits, of course. And that as such, you have reached a high MMR, which is a hidden number that supposedly makes you good at the game. This also means that you're going to supposedly go against other people that are good at the game through one mean or another. And that typically means that you will go against what you find at high MMR these days. The typical perks, the typical items, the typical map offerings, that meta, which is very prevalent, that's what you'll be going up against on average. Also on average, you will have some solo players, which is, sometimes happens, some full survivor friends parties, and something in between. You will not just be playing against solos, you will not just be playing against organized teams with perfect comms. Instead, you will be playing against what's realistic to find in a normal match, which is typically a mixture of both on average. Now, that being said, before we head straight into this tier list, 2 considerations. In some tier lists made by other people, the S tier killers are unbeatable and completely overpowered, and they should be nerfed. And the killers on the bottom D tier, they are unplayable and you can never win with them. That is not the case for my tier list. The killers at the top can be beaten consistently by good players. The killers at the bottom can do consistently well if played by skilled killers, no problem. Obviously, the ones at the top have it easier, hence the tier list, but do not use this tier list as a guide of which killers are viable, because in my view, almost all of these killers are viable on average if you play them well enough. Another thing to consider is the add-on situation. Some people make tier lists based on each killer's base kit without any add-ons, and that is very easy, but also not very realistic, because you will be playing with and against add-ons. So I don't find that so useful. On the other extreme, there's also people that only assume that the killer will be using their best add-ons every time. And I also don't think that's very realistic either. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that each killer is running a variety of different add-on combinations. Higher rarity, lower rarity, something in between. And I'll be trying to judge their strength based on that. Some killers are boosted by their add-ons a lot, some others not so much. We'll get into those details. Here's the tier list as it stands. Some of these placements are really hard to judge, but if you don't want to watch the entire video or even use the timestamps down below to skip to whichever part you're interested, the comment section is out of the open. Just type why I'm wrong and why you disagree with everything. You don't even need to watch the video, right? So yeah, feel free to do that. The gorgeous art that you're seeing right now is from Honeybear. So if you want to give them a thank you or see the art for yourself or buy it for yourself, you'll have a link for that in the description that you can check out right now. So we're going to be talking about some killers more or less in depth, depending on how much they've moved from previous tier lists and how much there is to unpack that's new. So with that in mind, let's talk about the nurse. Why is the nurse consistently placed as the #1 killer in most tier lists, and why is she now more than ever solidified in this position? Number one, the nurse has a power that basically allows her to ignore the base gameplay elements that other killers have to carefully navigate and play around. Windows, pallets, different elevations, different floors, walls with breakable walls. All of those things other killers have to play around for the most part. The nurse, with her ability to teleport through them, can almost always ignore. This alone makes the nurse a real threat, makes her powerful in almost any setting, against almost any loop. She has a really good chance to hit you or down you in just a few seconds. On top of that, her range of add-ons has only gotten better recently. Her brown add-ons are good, her yellow add-ons get very good. Her green add-ons are some of the strongest ones. She has some purple add-ons that are really powerful, and now she has a new iridescent ultra rare add-on that gives her 3 blinks with a very mild penalty to recharge speed. This is insane. Almost any rarity of add-ons that you could consider, the nurse has something very, very good available. Which means that almost no matter what, that any nurse you play against will be boosted by her add-ons considerably. And some of these add-ons are really easy to use and don't require any real skill or forethought. They are just net increases to her performance, which makes an even average nurse hard to deal with and hard to outplay. Even if you hold forward against her, she can catch up to you, especially with add-ons. A decisive strike, which would hurt another killer, she can pretty much land on top of you with a perfect blink in a straight line, even if you do not waste any time. She's really, really tough to verse. Although not unbeatable, a good team that splits up, that makes her have a hard time landing hits, that breaks line of sight, that uses Dead Heart, very popular survivor perk, against her to earn a little bit more time. They can beat a nurse, but that team can probably also beat anybody else. So she's definitely strong, has very few weaknesses in terms of maps that she can go to. In fact, she can perform pretty much as well as she does in a normal map in very, very tough or pallet dense maps, because she doesn't really care about pallets at all. So the nurse is basically good at any level you could place her in, and someone that plays her competently will show you this. And on top of that, this new patch has just made her better. What is there to say? Not much else. Next up is the Blight. Now, the Blight is not quite as capable as the nurse at ignoring normal gameplay rules. He does have to deal with windows. He does have to deal with pallets. But there is one thing that almost every other killer has to do that he is uniquely powerful at. And that is the game of catching up against a survivor that is holding forward or that is just very far away. The Blight is basically second to none when it comes to closing the gap. He is incredibly fast by default. Some of his add-ons, by the way, he has a range of add-ons that is ridiculously strong. Starting at yellow add-ons and all the way up to iridescence, his add-ons are really powerful. Some of his lesser used purple add-ons are being reworked and buffed in this update as well. So that's only salt to injury, really. His add-ons are great. And some of these add-ons, the ones that increase his speed, make him a very, very agile killer who can easily outspeed a nurse when it comes to closing the gap. That has a lot more maneuverability to him, so he doesn't get affected by difficult maps as much as a Hillbilly, for example. And that has a comparatively short cooldown compared to other killers that have to go through significant cooldown or that have to recharge their power for extended periods of time. Very little downtime for Blight, which means he's constantly in the action. Even in larger maps, he doesn't really mind. He can adapt to evolving situations by virtue of almost being able to be in 2 places at once, just because he's so fast. And then you've got add-ons that make survivors slower, that reveal their aura, that make them going down in 1 hit, that allow you to immediately use your power again after a successful hit. And these add-ons are just ridiculous. They are very easy to use for the most part. hard to predict, hard to understand from the survivor side. There's not a lot of feedback to them. And we haven't even gotten into the fact that this killer has a ridiculous skill ceiling to it, and that is also pretty good at loops. He does not get to use M1 perks, such as Save the Best for Last, or Sloppy Butcher, or Haunt the Ground, but it doesn't really matter, because insta-downing is only nice so that you don't have to catch up quickly after, slowly after, but this killer doesn't need that. Insta-down perks are not even necessary. Getting a hit in the open against a survivor is almost a given. The better Blights know how to flick around corners, how to make almost any loop potentially very, very unsafe, with add-ons only making it harder and harder for the survivors to consistently outrun them. Very few weaknesses in terms of maps, with only a couple really being tough. Some maps do have areas where your Blight will slide instead of bump into obstacles, but this is something that you can turn into a strength. If you know that you can slide on top of a surface, you can use it to your advantage to do crazy slide techniques and catch survivors from angles that they sometimes don't even see coming. So playing against a really, really strong Blight that understands how to use these techs in chase is incredibly, incredibly oppressive. And as I said, he does have incredibly good synergies, not only with his add-ons, but also with the strongest perks in the game. All of the good gen regression perks work wonders on him, and he has such good synergies with these perks that you see very little variety in terms of the perks that you'll see Blights use. Very, very strong, in my opinion. Nowadays, probably the second strongest killer in the game. Although maybe you could argue that. Next up is the Spirit. Now, the Spirit historically has lost a lot of her power over the years. She, in my opinion, was either tied or even ahead of Nurse in being number one. She could phase, and she would make a noise when she phased, which meant that survivors that saw you stand still had to guess, and that's changed. She also had collision, so she could immediately detect you. The collision, the vaulting animation, all of those things have been changed. So now we have to talk about the changes that have happened as a result of this patch. This patch has changed many of her add-ons and some of her base kit mechanics as well. So the current Spirit, compared to the one immediately before, is a little bit weaker, but still a force to be reckoned with. Let's talk about the things that she cannot do as well. Standing still no longer works as a mind game. If you stand still, the survivors will not hear your power, and when you begin to use your power, they will start to hear it. So you will no longer be able to just stand still, recover your power, and have a really good chance to trick a survivor into being out of position. They now have more up-to-date information about what you're doing. When you begin to use your power, you will hear, the survivors will hear a directional noise, a vaguely directional noise that tells them more or less where you're coming from. This means two things. On top of not being able to mind game by staying still, you will no longer be able to grab survivors that are working on a generator or going for an unhook or doing a totem or any other action like that the way you could before. Before, if you were at about 20 meters, that was more or less the sweet spot. If you were at about 20 meters worth of distance, you could trick a survivor into thinking that you were doing something else and then silently appear right next to them and grab them. So this is a power that, this didn't happen obviously against really good or aware survivors, but it could still happen every now and then. And if it did happen, it was a pretty big deal. This should never happen anymore. Now survivors have a vague idea of where you're coming from. But here's the thing, it is still a vague idea. If you hear, from a survivor point of view, if you hear a spirit come from the left, you don't know if she's inside the shack or outside the shack. There's no visual indication, only audio indication right now. So that means that survivors still need to make difficult decisions, and you still have a very good chance to outplay them by virtue of being very fast and still being somewhat invisible. In this regard, the Spirit is still really, really powerful. She's still an unpredictable, not as unpredictable, but she's still an unpredictable powerhouse in chase that has a really good chance to use small visual cues and sound cues to land hits on survivors. Now, some of the things that have also gone down for her. Survivors that run Iron Will can no longer be countered by Strider. Strider was a really popular perk on Spirit. You put it on, and even survivors with Iron Will would make noise. You could always strike them as long as they were injured. Survivors with Iron Will now are harder to counter. You'll need to rely on your ability to hear footsteps better. because Iron Will completely counters Strider, making it basically useless. So that's not a thing anymore. On top of that, her add-ons used to be really, really overtuned. She had great browns, good yellows, fantastic greens, some powerful purples, and some really strong iridescents. Now, many of her medium to good add-ons have been removed and repurposed, but it's pretty odd because her strongest add-ons are still there. Her strongest combination of Mother Daughter Ring and Yakuyoki Amulet, which gives her insane speed, super fast recovery, incredibly long duration at the cost of not seeing recent scratch mark, it still works. So her strongest add-ons still there. Some of her very, very good green combinations don't work anymore because they're gone, but she still has decent to good brown and yellow combinations of add-ons that do quite a lot. Some of her new add-ons can also help to catch survivors a little bit off guard, like the Uchiwa that allows you to recover after being stunned, or the Iridescent that allows you to recover after breaking a pallet or a breakable wall. There is some unpredictability in her kit, which is a good thing, but overall her add-ons are definitely weaker on average, even though, as I said, she still has some of the strongest ones from before. Until she gets nerfed again, or these add-ons get nerfed again, they are still very powerful. Oddly enough, the duration add-ons still give extra recovery. This is an oversight that we've pointed out for the developers for years, and it seems to have gone unaddressed. So at least on the PTB, the duration add-ons still give recovery. So she still has very, very good add-ons for their rarity. And she's still quite oppressive in the 1v1, but she's just not, she doesn't get as many things for free as before. All in all, if you play her well, you have a killer that has a small terror radius that is now harder to hear, that has good mobility if she needs it, that has good 1v1 if she needs it, and uses basic attacks, so she synergizes quite well with many, many perks. Overall, she's powerful, just not as overwhelmingly powerful and overwhelmingly difficult to deal with from the survivor side as before. Before, spirits made even good survivors second guess themselves and made good survivors not look so good. Now, good survivors will give you a harder time. You will actually need to be quite good at spirit yourself if you want to play her at this level. Next up is Hag. Now, Hag, in my opinion, has gone down very significantly since the previous tier list. So it is almost surprising to find her again in the fourth spot. And that is only because other killers have also dropped down, or everything around her has shifted in a way that still places her here. Let's talk about the things that make Hag a little bit weaker than some time ago. The changes to borrowed time are very significant. In the past, with a small terror radius, you could do a lot of damage from a distance. If you put a survivor in the basement and they were rescued, you could immediately teleport to a trigger trap and hit either the rescuer, maybe with Make Your Choice and instant on them, or the rescuee, the rescued person, and then you would instant on them as well. That was a ton of pressure. This is a lot harder nowadays because borrowed time no longer works off distance or terror radius. In fact, it just works in general. That means that borrowed time is now actually a really, really strong tool from the survivors. If they manage to unhook from the basement, the person with borrowed time can trigger 4 or 5 traps, as many as you've said. And if you teleport and hit them, I mean, that's good, but it's not a down. And you will be losing a lot of traps in the process. So the changes to borrowed time are really, really strong. Obviously, survivors will be bringing a lot more items than before. If you are at high MMR, that is something that you can deal with, unlike other killers. But even if you bring Franklins or whatever, you will probably have a bit of a harder time than before. But it's mostly the changes to borrowed time that really hurt the Hag. What's still on your side as a Hag is the fact that when you go into a match, the survivors do not know that it's a Hag. If you set up a perimeter, a web of traps, if you will, successfully, most teams will struggle to, even if you lose 2 or 3 generators for that, as long as you set up a web of traps and you have one person on the hook in the first half of the game, that will make most teams have a really, really hard time playing against you. In tournaments, Hags are not nearly as successful. If a survivor gets hit, they will immediately run back to the area that they know is safe and either heal or wait for their team to support them. They will never, ever, ever give you a down. I've heard that in tournaments, Hag games can go up upwards of 20 minutes or 25 minutes because the survivors play it extremely slow. But that's something that virtually never happens in public games. In public games, survivors panic, they step into your web and they go down immediately, or you hit them and then you corral them towards the rest of your traps. Even if they put up a bit of a resistance, you are still very likely to catch one of them sooner or later. And at this point, many of the perks that other killers are affected by are basically useless against you. If they have Iron Will, you don't typically care. If they have Spring Burst, that's not necessarily a horrible thing. As long as you have pre-trapped an area and you play it smart, being a defensive killer with Hag pays off big time, and most teams are not ready to counter it. A really good team would immediately notice that it's a Hag and then send at least one person to harass your traps. At that point, if they are good at harassing you and you're not good at reacting to it, you will start to lose time. They will pop a few generators, maybe you'll get a person, but then they'll do a few trades and it will be game over for you. And that is really rough if that happens. But it's something that you can help, and it's something that is honestly, from my experience, quite rare. The Hag, almost less than any other killers, doesn't really depend on perks at all. Your power allows you to have information being fed to you, allows you to get hits, allows you to deny loops, and you do not need a lot of perks on top of that. Generator defending perks are okay, chasing perks can be okay, but you do not ultimately need them, which means that if you have 4 perks that all fail to do their job, you will still be capable of just pulling the game back from your power alone. On top of that, the Hag has an amazing collection of add-ons. With only one exception, the families of add-ons from brown to green are all fantastic, giving her further teleportation, faster setting speed, auto reading, as well as a longer uptime of each trap, which can also be useful. Then she does have one purple add-on called the Rusty Shackles, which is very hard for unprepared survivors to deal with. One of her nastiest add-ons. And even though it's not very meaningful, she has had some of her worst add-ons, like the Waterlog Shoe rework, making her a little bit faster. So she does have many unpredictable add-ons, and the ones that just increase her already strong base kit make her even better. As much as I understand how difficult Hag can be against prepared teams that harass you, from my experience playing her, almost every team you meet will be overconfident, and she can use very mean perks late game to make even good teams fall after doing really well for the first half. In my opinion, she can do things that other killers cannot dream of in maps that have no right to be good for any killer. And even though it's a bit of a stretch, I still think that she's very powerful. That being said, with the new Boon Totem perks, it will be harder to track survivors that are healing. It will be harder to prevent them from healing after taking a hit. You are at the mercy of the survivors being a little bit dumb and making at least one mistake. If they do play flawlessly, you will begin to falter and to struggle a little bit. And I believe that's almost all there is to say about the Hag. Next up, we drop a tier, but the jump is really not that significant. We have the killers in the A tier, starting with the Oni. Now, the Oni has a very significant weakness that is well understood by everyone, and that is the fact that he starts the game as an M1 basic killer. He doesn't have a power until he lands a hit on a survivor. Now, in a tournament or against 4 survivors that are ridiculously good, this is very painful and very meaningful, because if they play it incredibly safe and you do not get that first hit, your early game will be disastrous, will be very bad. But in a normal scenario, in your average match, that doesn't really mean all that much. Believe it or not, if you go out and play well and count how long it takes for your first hit to happen, it's not minutes. It's usually typically just seconds. And once that first hit occurs, the Pandora box opens and anything can happen. This killer is incredibly unpredictable, has a ridiculously good potential to snowball once he has his power, being able to down multiple survivors very quickly. And then the game enters a cycle of sorts where you get your blood back, you use your power, you get your blood back, you use your power, and survivors can more or less delay this by making sure that your blood doesn't come easily. But once you get started, typically the game tilts a lot more towards your favor. So what are some of the things that the Oni has on his side? Number one, his mobility works regardless of map. Unlike other killers, he doesn't need line of sight, he doesn't mind bushes, he doesn't mind fences, he doesn't mind obstacles. His mobility is really, really good regardless of the terrain. The skill ceiling to using his power is incredibly high. And you notice this more and more the better Onis you play against. Good Onis have the ability to flick and do ridiculous 180 hits with their Cannibal once they're in Demon Fury. Good Onis can also use their extended lunge in chase as a bit of a coup de grace of sorts to get insta-downed. Needless to say, his add-on range is pretty damn good. His iridescence and browns are mostly worthless, but almost anything in between is good. You have faster activation. His top knot has been nerfed, but is still very powerful. You have faster duration, faster speed, all of which interact with each other in very, very good ways. You can make it so that after a hit, you can get your blood very quickly. You can make it so that when you are fast, survivors have very little room to maneuver and react. And then on top of that, you can learn how to do flicks around corners. So this is a killer that if you can get started, almost any survivors, almost anywhere in the map is susceptible to going down very, very quickly. And no matter how bad of a game you have, as long as you control the map to some degree, you almost always have the potential to completely make the team crumble. It doesn't matter if you have no hooks and they've done 4 gens. If they make a big enough mistake, you can get 3 people on the ground easily and then come back from that. And understanding just how ridiculous the skill ceiling to using his power is I think a big component of why he is so high as well. Much like other killers in this tier list that are this high, he has really good synergies with good perks. Using Tinkerer on him, using the best regression perks on him to let him know where to go, where to find survivors, all of that stuff just works. So you'll never have a problem picking perks. Almost any direction you take, he can make it work. And I think that's what makes him a very, very solid pick for the A tier. Moving on to the Huntress, we have a bit of an opposite situation. The Huntress has a really, really hard time finding synergy with perks. She cannot use stealth because of her big lullaby. She cannot use basic attack perks because she mostly uses her special attack. And because of her low mobility, many perks that give information are not as useful or cannot be taken advantage of as easily with Huntress. She also needs to reload, which slows her down, gives her less time to do actions like kicking generators and so on, or defending totems in a pinch. But that's it. That's her weaknesses. That's also the fact that you need line of sight, so some indoor maps can be tough. But despite all of that, with the Huntress, you have a killer with that tremendously high skill ceiling, one that only seems to get higher and higher. You see a player of Huntress with several thousand hours, and each of those hours shows. With Huntress, you are only one tiny mistake away from going down very, very quickly. Her add-ons are pretty impressive, despite having a few add-ons here and there that are gimmicky and rather useless. Her tried and true add-ons, cooldown, extra hatchets, are very, very threatening. And what they typically translate into is, you make a tiny mistake, you take a hell state loss. You make a tiny mistake as a team, you have 2 people down in the basement, and good luck getting out of there. That alone makes her very, very threatening. She is a killer that is quite punishing if you don't know what you're doing, or if you have a particularly bad start. But she does have a lot of tools, mostly from her add-ons and mostly from understanding how to control the map, that make her really, really threatening. And again, I think it's the skill ceiling that sells it for me and why I would place her this high. Even if you only go for something like yellow and brown rarity, you still have very, very strong add-ons that make her also a little bit unpredictable. And she probably is one of the killers that has changed the least over time, so I don't think I have a lot more to say about about her. Going into the next update, she will have to rely on different perks than some of the ones that you might have seen in the past. It's very popular for Huntress to run things like Barbecue and Chili, Nurse's Calling. I think you will probably want to go for more solid, reliable picks because people will be able to heal themselves faster and they might be able to hide themselves with Shadow Step, the new Michaela Reed perk. But other than that, if you're going for reliable perks, I still think she's really powerful. Next, we have a killer that is actually going to thrive in the next update. Considering how strong add-ons are in this patch and how good self-healing is, we have a killer that completely puts a stop, or at least considerably puts a stop to all of that. The Plague has always been strong, but she's had a lot of things holding her back. And in this next patch, some of those things are gone. She now makes survivors heal not in 6, but in 8 seconds. She has a much more lenient cooldown speed, which makes her far less punishing for missing and encourages her to be a lot more aggressive with her pukes. But almost more important than that, and some of the add-on changes that she's received, is the new infection rates. Now, survivors in the past, if you could infect in a single puke, that was awesome, but difficult. Otherwise, you would need to infect them and wait for the passive infection to do their job. Now, a survivor that was passively infected would typically get fully infected and injured within 50 seconds, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, depending on what they do, or how much puke you put in them. Those 50 seconds have now been effectively halved if you meet certain conditions. If you puke on a generator and the survivor has to work on that generator while it's still infected, the infection rate basically duplicates. And that is insane. That means that your ability to keep people, to make people injured without even being close to them has now been put on steroids. This is very, very significant. Before, the Plague had one fountain that she could start with, a lot of cooldown to work around, and a slow but somewhat reliable way of injuring survivors. Now your way of injuring survivors is a lot faster, has a lot less cooldown. Some of your add-ons have been reworked. Even the cooldown add-ons that used to be really strong don't feel as necessary because you're just so fast no matter what you do. Her red puke is still really insane. So that means that survivors will either need to be injured even more or will need to cleanse even more. Now, if they remain injured, it comes down to your ability to use your one fountain by default, more with add-ons, we'll get to that. But if they start healing, that's when things get interesting, because the Plague, when powered up by her red puke, is ridiculously powerful. And some of her strongest add-ons are still very much there and will still help you a lot when using your Corrupt Purge. With a Corrupt Purge, you can hit survivors in every low loop in the game. Card loops in Outer Haven, basically death traps. Many somewhat high loops with rocks you can still hit if you use and abuse the hitbox. On top of that, you lose less speed after a hit, so the next one will happen even quicker. And you also are an absolute monster at denying altruistic play. A survivor unhooking another survivor, even if they get behind the hook, unlike Huntress, she can hit right through the hooked person. So you can stop a survivor from unhooking, or if you prefer, hit both of them with your red puke after they're done. So she is a really, really strong killer when that happens, and you will have more and more situations where you get to use her power. So, with that out of the way, and considering the very, very, very powerful set of add-ons that she has, which all range from good to pretty damn good, almost across the rarity spectrum. What are her weaknesses? You still have the dedicated situations where you puke on a survivor and they cough, but they don't get infected, which is very frustrating and hasn't been addressed. This is a bit of a nitpick, but her whispers are still extremely loud and obnoxious to deal with in chase when you power up. She's still a very, very loud, very tall killer that can easily be seen in most loops. The mind games are difficult, if even possible sometimes. It's very possible that your early game will be difficult because survivors run you well around tall structures or buildings. Not so easy catching survivors off guard in maps like Batham, where they literally are protected by layers and layers and layers of walls and fences. where you can do nothing. So consider those situations. Yes, the plague is a little bit difficult. You also have to consider the fact that if it comes to the end game, survivors will typically make a big recovery. So 3 survivors injured will now all heal up from fountains, and it will be very, very hard to capitalize on that at the end of the game, because by the time you drink up from one of your fountains, you have all survivors escaping through the exit gates anyway. Another thing about her that is still very annoying is the RNG that comes from your fountains. Sometimes your fountain spawns, the one fountain that's red spawns right next to you, and that is awesome, and you can pick it up right away. Sometimes it spawns in a completely desolate corner of the map where you literally have no chance to pick it up to any strong effect. And if the map you're playing has a lot of edges with fountains, like swamp maps, survivors can cleanse very safely without you being able to really pressure that. That being said, she does have, even though some of her old add-ons have been nerfed or reworked, most of them, as a result of her changes, are now stronger or as strong as before. So a very confident place in her right here. After Plague, we come to Pyramid Head, who has not really gotten much love in this update. That is still okay. He still does play around some of the strongest survivor perks in the game that are very, very common. That is hook-related perks. Borrow Time, Will Make It, Decisive Strike, all perks like that you can, to a degree, play around by sending survivors to cages. However, let's start with the bad things. Why Pyramid Head is not any higher. You have a killer that moves at 115, so he has at least normal mobility, that can basically get hits in almost any loop. In fact, if you have survivors close up, you can get hits on multiple survivors at a time, which makes him extremely deadly. Coming out of basement, he can hit down the stairs, or unhooking in front of him, he can hit both survivors. Uncaging in front of him, he can hit both survivors or more. So he's a killer that is really, really threatening from close up, who has incredible, almost limitless possibilities to get hits in almost any loop in the game. So why isn't he even stronger than what replaces him? Well, number one, survivors need to be close to you for you to use your power. Before, Pyramid Head could place down his power and then M1, and even if he placed down his power for just a little bit, he only slowed himself down a tiny bit. The slowdown on Pyramid Head as of several patches ago is very significant. His ability to M2 into M1 is completely gone. So he is a slightly more predictable killer. And survivors that keep distance from you and keep holding forward will make it hard for you to sometimes get downs in a timely manner. Unfortunately, his add-on range is quite limited. His iridescents are garbage. His purple add-ons are mostly garbage. His brown add-ons don't have enough of an effect to make a big difference, so it typically comes down to a combination of green and yellow add-ons, some of which are okay, none of which are universally super, super strong. You could put on the very good range add-ons, which are arguably some of his best, and then find that all of your encounters happen at close range and you don't need the range. They could be useless. You could use the add-ons to leave the trails on the ground for longer and be in a situation where that's not even useful. So unfortunately, unlike, say, Nurse, he doesn't have any add-ons that are universally good that will always feel worth it. There's a lot of potential for his add-ons, even his best add-ons, to be mediocre, which is a big shame. That being said, he has a very high skill level. Knowing and understanding how you can hit survivors in the most unpredictable ways can really pay off and catch many survivors off guard. Of course, we haven't even talked about his ability to cage and then immediately tunnel someone out of a cage. He has the incredible and almost unparalleled ability to completely ignore Border Time and Decisive as anti-tunneling perks and get someone tunneled very early into the game with very difficult counterplay from the survivors if it already happens. So his ability to get a survivor out of the game early is very powerful. And it only takes 1 or 2 bad survivors in your team for your team to collapse if he deals with them like this. So that is something that definitely keeps him up here. The smarter and smarter pyramid heads will be able to get hits in more and more creative places. Survivors are not stupid. If you try to go for pot shots everywhere, you will ultimately end up wasting your own time. Your power can be dead harder through. Medkits can still damage you. Big maps will still damage you. There's definitely, obviously, you cannot use some strong perks such as Pop Goes a Weasel or Barbecue because they have strange synergies with your perk, with your power. So some of those things hurt him. Ultimately, he's still very, very strong, has a really good chance to win, is often seen in competitive games because he is capable of dealing with almost any loop in the game. Ultimately, that is what makes him a real threat. I would like to see some changes to his add-ons, and I would like to see him get a bit more love, but even though his edges are rough, he is still a very, very strong killer in my estimation. Next up is Twins. And Twins goes down to the B tier. Honestly, it could still be an A tier killer. This killer has come down a lot in many small and insidious ways. They still retain the one thing that makes them really, really strong, but they honestly feel so bad to play. Let's go over, ultimately, whether they really are down here or whether they should be a little bit higher will depend on how they adapt to the new super healing perks that are coming up in the next patch. But let's discuss the Twins. So with the Twins, you have Charlotte and Victor. Charlotte moves at 115 normal killer speed, normal killer properties, and she can send out Victor, who moves incredibly fast and is basically a really good chase ender. In almost any situation, you have a massive advantage with Victor. Even the best survivors will struggle to last long against Victor in most areas of the game. Some exceptions for sure. Even if they are very good, Victor has a really good range of add-ons to help him. All the way from Brown to Iridescent, the add-ons, despite having a lot of useless add-ons, there are add-ons at every variety that are pretty good. So you can have a Brown add-on to attack much quicker, the Toy Sword, and it's incredibly good for a Brown. You have green movement speed, purple movement speed, purple spinning top to make survivors drop items. Very powerful in the current meta. Iridescents that are pretty good, especially the stealth one, the silencing cloth, very good. Makes them even better in the maps that they're already naturally good at. But despite all of this, despite having a killer that can win almost any one chase, and with a reasonably solid pick of add-ons, what makes the Twins so difficult, so hard, and sometimes so underwhelming? The changes that they've received over the months, the nerfs to their cooldown speed, and the evolving meta around them have all been really rough. So when the Twins were released, they had the ability to use Ruin and Undying, which was easily their staple combination. Ruin and Undying are now not as powerful as they used to be. You do not get to cleanse 4 or 5 totems to do Ruin. Now 1 or 2 and it's gone. They're much harder to defend as a result, obviously. And once they're gone, you really lose the pressure that is just so strong on these two killers. So Ruin and Dying, a lot harder to use at higher MMR these days, and obviously has been nerfed since last year. On top of that, Victor could hit survivors even if they dead harded through him. This is no longer the case. You now will eat dead hards. You will also eat borrowed times. Before, if a survivor was rescued, Victor could very quickly down a survivor off the hook, which was very nasty, and then immediately or almost immediately go and hit the person that rescued them. Now, when you hit a survivor off the hook, if they have borrowed time, that borrowed time always will be there. Before, borrowed time worked from terror radius, which Victor has 0, but now it works regardless of distance or terror radius. So borrowed time is actually now a massive counter to Victor. If you hit the person with borrowed time, they will survive it. They will be able to kick you, and now you have a much bigger cooldown for hitting a survivor. A cooldown that is agonizingly slow. So if you hit a survivor and you want to switch back to Charlotte immediately to go for the pickup, it takes you roughly 6 or 7 seconds between your input and you getting control back of Charlotte. Those 7 seconds are an eternity. An eternity. A survivor from very, very far away can come and kick you if they have to, or they can just wait and use Unbreakable, use Adrenaline, use Strong Medkits, use We're Gonna Live Forever, anything it takes to heal back to full health or heal from the ground. In the upcoming patch, you'll also have to worry about survivors healing themselves fast with Circle of Healing, which is very, very concerning and could honestly hurt the Twins a lot. So what ultimately happens when you play the Twins against survivors that are smart is one of two things. Either you send out Victor and you attach it to a healthy survivor, and then that survivor will typically hold Victor hostage for at least 30 seconds and take him far away. It's true that during this 30 seconds, that survivor is doing nothing, but he is denying you of your one power. And during those 30 seconds, what they're typically going to do is go to a part of the map where after the 30 seconds, they get you call Victor back and they start doing a gen or healing or doing something there, opening a gate, whatever it might be. So they reposition during those 30 seconds. The bigger the map, the harder they'll reposition, and you have no power. This is rough. If the other survivors are playing smart and you lose Victor for 30 seconds, there's no add-on or nothing at all that you can do other than hoping that the survivor is silly and removes Victor as soon as possible, which survivors that are smart will just not do. The other thing that you can do is try to get a survivor injured and then send out Victor to down them. And that is better, but you have the two problems. Number one, you need to hit a survivor with your basic attack, which is hard sometimes. It's not necessarily easy. And then after you down that survivor, you need to hope that the survivor is not too far away. If the survivor is too far away, they could get picked up with Unbreakable. They could hop into a locker, making Victor basically useless because you're too far with Charlotte. Lots of things can go wrong in that plan. So what ultimately needs to be done is for you to make the best possible decision at any given time. You need to go for the survivors that are easy hits and do easy hits with Charlotte. You need to use Victor on the survivors that are in a good spot, get them injured, hope they don't heal too quickly, then recall Victor, then send it back, down them, or down someone else. And there is a lot of difficult decisions to make. It is very, very, very hard to play Twins. Not only do you need to be good with Victor, you also need to make all of the right decisions, which is very, very tough against perks and add-ons and items that may or may not be there. So with the next update, you will have survivors running back to the part of the map where they can heal themselves and doing all of these strategies even more. If you are not so good with Victor, you will pounce against the wall and immediately get kicked by survivors. Even if the survivors take a while, your cooldown is so big, they have a lot of window of time to punish you. If you are amazing at Twins and you make all of the right decisions and you bring a build that sustains your playstyle, then the Twins are pretty good. And in fact, they can pressure teams in ways that other killers really cannot. But I find it hard to believe that most people can do that consistently with this killer. You really need to play them extremely well, and any small mistake will undo a lot of good decisions made up to that point. For that reason, I'm feeling, and for the unspeakable atrocity that is their cooldown, even playing them correctly feels awful in my opinion. But that is a bit of a subjective, non-relevant factor. So trying to brush that aside, it's possible that Twins could be a little bit higher than I'm rating them here. At any rate, we will probably find out. Next up, we have Cannibal. Cannibal is a very straightforward killer. He has the ability to insta-down survivors. In fact, if multiple survivors are grouped up, he can insta-down multiple of them, making altruistic plays in front of him, at the very least, very difficult. We are in a meta of securing kills. So this killer, almost more than anyone else, is the killer that works to secure kills. If you want to secure your 2 kills, with this killer, there is no strategy invented yet that will allow survivors to realistically get away with making some bold play. Other killers, they can be body blocked against, they can be stunned in some way, their powers have recharged. With this killer, if you sit in front of someone on the hook, there's basically nothing they can do. That is a guaranteed kill, and that is something that is worth mentioning. On top of being a defensive monster, he's also offensively powerful. He can shred through pallets relatively fast. He can shred through breakable walls relatively fast as well, which I guess comes in handy sometimes. And he has a base kit that allows him to do this reasonably well. Survivors that are caught in the open typically die very fast. At higher MMR, this shouldn't happen. Survivors should be using their pallets well. In fact, if they're really smart, they'll try to stun you with the pallet so that you don't break it immediately, giving them extra time. They'll take you away from their teammates so that your high pressure tool cannot be used on multiple survivors at once. And they'll try to play around windows really well so that your chainsaw is worthless and you're forced to M1. But the Cannibal has answers to all of this. You can use Corrupt Intervention, you can run Discordance, you can run perks to constantly find multiple survivors and bother multiple at a time. For windows, you can run Bamboozle, which is a really good perk on him, and shut down preemptively windows that would be troublesome, and now force them to use pallets. And as for the pallets, if you bring the best add-ons available for Cannibal, and he's got quite a few good ones, the pallets are really, really dangerous. Survivors will run out of them really, really quickly if you zone them out well, or if they're a little bit greedy, they can go down very, very quickly. Now, even though Cannibal has a lower skill floor than some other killers, he's very easy to pick up. His skill ceiling, how high his skill ceiling can go, is deceivingly high. If you have the right add-ons to increase your speed and increase your charges, your charge durations, that is, the Cannibal can get hits in loops that other killers could never dream of. Not only that, he has insta-down hits. So if you play against a really good Cannibal that is good at shaving really, really tightly around loops, you will need to pre-drop pallets very, very fast, or else you risk going down almost anywhere. With some of his best add-ons, many loops that are manageable against many killers become incredibly risky against him. And once he does catch you, he can put you next to a generator or next to his ruin or next to whatever exit gate he's defending and defend multiple things at once with quite a presence. So even though he has a nice range of add-ons, useful browns, useful yellows, some good utility add-ons in the purple and greens, he does have a few add-ons that just increase his chainsaw, the potential of his chainsaw to a degree that makes him quite scary. For this reason, I think he's very, very uniquely suited to play in the meta and the MMR system that we play in. And if you are very, very, very good at playing him, you will be able to use all of these tools very effectively, completely destroying teams that are not super prepared to play against this. Now, truth be told, can you win every match as a Cannibal? No. If you play against survivors that truly do split up, that use their windows well, that play preemptively against your preemptive bamboozle, that go down in corners to make your low mobility and lack of teleportation abilities a real issue, then you will lose. But at that point, you would have probably lost that match with most of the other killers as well. So he is definitely very, very good at taking advantage of weak links. And unless it's a pretty strong team all over and you make some unfortunate decisions or you go to a really tough map, you do have a very good chance of beating almost any team with Cannibal. Next up is Nemesis. Now, let's talk about some of the negative things about Nemesis. He's very tall, he is very loud, he does have many add-ons that are not super great. He does have 2 zombies that are widely inconsistent. Sometimes they can win your game, sometimes they can get stuck in a corner of the map and do nothing unless you go out of your way to kill them. You have an ability that hits survivors get a speed boost from it, and they don't even get injured, which means you have to hit them 3 times. And not only that, they also have the ability to heal themselves from this injury by using vaccines and forcing you to hit them 3 times again. So why is this killer not the worst killer in the game? Well, strap in. He's got many things going for him that are not immediately apparent. So number 1, he is a normal speed movement killer with a very, very strong chasing tool that can use a variety of perks reasonably well for one reason or another. And despite the zombies being inconsistent, even at their worst, they still give you something that is very valuable, which is information. If you play against a group with several flashlights and your zombies are constantly stunned next to generators, that is information telling you that someone's on that generator right now without any perks, without any add-ons. You are getting that information right there. And once you get close to a survivor, what can they realistically do to avoid you? The answer is nothing. The answer is almost nothing. Nemesis starts in tier 1, where he cannot break pallets or walls, and his range is only 5 meters. And this is the one part of the game where survivors actually do have a bit of an edge on you. Without add-ons, you need to hit at least 2 different survivors, or 1 survivor 3 times or something like that, to get to tier 2. This can be rough. This is the weakest point for Nemesis. But if you get past this initial bump, if you have Marvin's Blood, which is a yellow affordable add-on, 2 hits on the same survivor, or 1 hit on 2 different survivors, or even a hit on a survivor and some other zombies with some other add-ons, and you get to tier 2. And when you get to tier 2, things change dramatically. You become the best pallet breaker in the game by far. There is no killer that can break pallets as quickly or as remotely as Nemesis can. You can leave a pallet down, and if the survivors go back to it, you can zone them and break the pallet just like that. You can do that from up to 5 or later 6 meters of distance. So other killers that can shred through pallets, they need to waste those few seconds going to and from. Nemesis, while you are chasing survivors, you can break pallets around you and lose almost no distance. This also extends to breakable walls, which you wouldn't think is that important, but for a killer that can break a breakable wall and still move as he's doing it, it is tremendously powerful at times to break walls and not really have to choose between doing that and losing distance. So his ability to break pallets is ridiculously underrated. His ability to ignore drop pallets is also really good because you do not have any urgency unless there's any means necessary or something. You don't have any urgency to break pallets. A pallet that is down can be used against you for most other killers very, very reasonably, unless you're, say, a nurse. With Nemesis, you don't worry. If a pallet ever gets used against you, you will most likely hit the survivor vaulting the pallet, or hit them after they vaulted, or remove it before they even get to it. So his ability to remove pallets makes him very, very powerful, even in maps that are filled with them, because survivors that don't play around them really well will get hit. And even if survivors ignore pallets altogether and only try to go for windows, Nemesis is disgustingly good at windows. Yes, he does need to hit you 3 times, but he's going to hit you 3 times almost anywhere. If you understand the way his hitboxes work, and we have a video on the 50 wins Nemi video explaining it, some visual representation. If you understand how his hitboxes work and you use them and drag them, survivors have very, very, very little counterplay once they are within certain range, and the hit is overwhelmingly on your side to happen. Unlike other killers that require very, very, very difficult timing, or they need to reload, or they need to be very mindful of the miss. With Nemesis, you have a very minor cancel window, a very forgiving cooldown. If you miss, it's really not the end of the world, even though if you're good, you're almost never going to miss. And the shorter cooldown in general means that you have a built-in save the best for last of sorts. And what this means is if you hit a survivor in a certain loop, they don't get enough speed to actually get out of that cornered loop. And one hit leads to the other one very, very quickly. While you're doing that, you're getting rid of pallets, you're getting rid of pallets, you're getting rid of more pallets, and eventually you get to tier 3. And in tier 3, you can set yourself up to drag your tentacle from even more disgusting angles because you move at 100%, which means that anytime you're mind gaming around the rock, you give the survivors very, 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 very little room for mistake, if any at all. On top of that, you have zombies that can occasionally give you information, that can occasionally give you free hits, or who can occasionally corner survivors or face camp them at hooks, giving you extra hits or forcing survivors into certain corners that you then take advantage of. He makes adequate use of many strong perks in the game. He has very decent chances to win against survivors in indoor maps where his zombies are harder to avoid. In outdoor maps, your tentacle is also useful, and they have to go further to pick up the crates. And some of these add-ons can be okay. And that's it. That's Nemesis. A very, very difficult killer to avoid from close up. The way to beat it, keep him in tier 1 as long as possible. Hope that he's a little bit inexperienced and bait a few tentacle attacks that end up missing, which can happen. And get lucky with the zombies. Make sure they don't harass you too much at the gens that are critical. And Nemesis can certainly be beaten. But he is a killer with a tremendously high skill ceiling that really, really rewards you for practicing him and understanding how his kit works together. Next up is our newcomer, the latest addition to the killer roster, Pinhead. Pinhead's add-ons, I can say it already, get a little bit ridiculous. He's got some moderately okay-ish low rarity add-ons with a very decent green or two, with some very strong purples and perhaps the strongest iridescent in the game, comparatively speaking. So his add-ons are ridiculous. With some of his strongest add-ons, I reckon this killer can easily climb up in the tier list to several spots where he is right now. But if we consider all of his add-ons, in general, he doesn't quite rank as high. So this killer has many things going for him. The first and foremost is that he has a passive ability to slow down the game. Survivors will be harassed by the chain hunt if they do not solve the cube. And if they don't pick it up and do it. And this makes survivors every now and then have to worry about picking up the cube, solving it, and giving you a chance to obviously stop them and delay them from doing so. So this slowdown is not anything incredible that will win you games by itself, but it does test the coordination of a team. If you're playing against solos and they have the attitude of, oh, someone else will do it, they will often find themselves in a situation where there's a person on the hook, there's a person on the ground, I need to heal because I'm injured, the killer's in the middle of it all, and where's the last person? Oh, they're doing the cube, no gens are being done, everything is going south, and the killer is incredibly comfy in that position, and this team is falling apart. So that side ability already puts the team on some stress, and some teams crumble under the stress. That's why probably this killer is very good against low rank players that are a little bit clueless. When you play against better players, this will not happen as much. People will be quite smart. They will pick up the cube when it's convenient. They will not pick it up immediately if they don't have to. In fact, you will often have a survivor with decisive strike go out of the way to pick up the cube and solve it. And if you stop him, well, he's got decisive strike, so you've wasted your time chasing a survivor that is virtually invincible for the next 20 or 30 seconds, or however long the timer has left on it. So smarter survivors will definitely adapt to this. But on top of that, you do have a lot of tools. The first is that if you are incredibly aware at the start and throughout the match, you can guess where the cube will be. And if you do your thing of chasing and injuring and hooking survivors, and you also keep in mind where the cube will spawn by keeping track of where every player is and understanding the complex but not indecipherable formula of where the cube spawns, the cube basically tries to spawn away from everyone. So if you understand the logic behind it, you can constantly either find the cube yourself, which will force the survivors into a slowdown and force them to find the cube again, which is very good for you, or at least be around the area so that when someone picks it up, you now harass that person, and at the end, if you down them with the cube, you also trigger it yourself, which slows them down, which puts the team under some real stress. So you have a skill-dependent slowdown that the better you are, the harder it will hit survivors. So it's not something that is just a noob stomper. It's actually something you can pour time and skill into that will be more and more powerful the better you are at controlling the elements of the map. So that's already wonderful and probably one of the better things about Pinhead. On top of that, you have the ability to send out a possessed chain. And this possessed chain allows you to see from afar. It can be a really nice scouting tool. There's a generator on the second floor that I cannot see. Other killers, you will need to get very close and maybe confirm that it's being done or not. With this killer, you can send out your power just to check, just to visually check And that's also a nice tool to have. If you hit a survivor with this chain, you will bind them and slow them down. It works very much like a Clown or Freddy slowdown in loops, but if you use it right, you can basically slow down the survivors and get a hit before they can make it to the pallet or to the window, because it forces them to slow vault it or to drop it slowly or vault slowly from one side. It's a really powerful, quite useful tool to have. As I've said, there are some add-ons that make this tool much stronger. Namely, the Fang makes you insta-down, it makes you insta-injure healthy survivors. This add-on is absolutely disgustingly powerful. I expect it to be nerfed. And then there's the Foggy Black Lens, which allows you to see the auras of survivors that you've hooked. This makes this killer very good at getting mind-gamey hits, and it's also really powerful, with some other add-ons that are also strong because they delay the completion of the box, or because they give you other assistances here and there, like extra chains and so on. So you have a bit of anti-loop, you have a bit of slowdown, you get a lot of information across the board from all the little aspects of your power. Why isn't this killer even higher on the list? Mostly the thing that gatekeeps this killer, the skill involved in this killer is ridiculously high. Let's just put that out of the way. You need to be incredibly good. You need to be able to hit people with your chain, which is difficult. It's like hitting someone with a chainsaw with the Hillbilly. It's hard. You need to be able to place the portals right, very much like the nurse needs to teleport right. You need to play your normal M1s well. You need to judge the distances between loops, much like Clown, and know if you're going to get a hit. You will be punished very harshly if you are not very good at any of these things. So you need to be good at a variety of aspects of his kit to truly get the best out of him. But what if you really are that good? Then what's the deal? Well, the deal is that his power is inconsistent, largely inconsistent in chase. If a survivor is in an already strong structure, like say the shack, putting a chain on them is very ineffective, because if they walk through a doorway, the chains that have just attached to them will now disappear immediately. The chains that are broken by the environment try to reattach themselves to the survivor, but these reattached chains are very easy to dodge, and they are very weak. So your initial chain needs to be really good and needs to happen in the open in a way that the survivor cannot quickly break it with a tree, with a door frame, or even with yourself. Because in many loops, if you're unlucky, the two of the chains will spawn from the area that you're coming, and you yourself break the chains as you walk past them. So that means that even though a chained survivor cannot use Death Hard, which is really nice, sometimes when you get to them, you will break the two chains left, and then they will use Death Hard. So the hardest part of this killer is having to deal with such inconsistencies. And even when obviously, if you play bad, you will immediately set yourself back a lot. But even if you play well, you will find situations where a really good chain somehow ends up in the survivor barely losing any distance whatsoever. And it's not always clear whether that's your fault or not, whether you misjudged, or whether the survivor just happened to have the luck of the century and the chains broke really quickly through environment or other means. On top of this, you have to also take into considerations that survivors are not stupid. They will make it very hard for you to hit the chain. They will play smart and understand that if they need to pre-drop a pallet, they're going to pre-drop it. And at that point, if the pallet is safe enough, you'll just need to break it like every other killer. Unfortunately, after you slow down a survivor with your chain, you do not have the immediate ability to vault or break a pallet. Bamboozle, Brutal Strength are some perks that could be really interesting on him, but they don't really work, because when you come out of your power, you have this very annoying pause. This also happens if you miss your power, you have a very significant 5-second or so cooldown before you can use it again, and this can stack up. This can also happen if you try to place your portal in a way that last second turns invalid and it turns red. You will lose your power for a few seconds. So these little inconsistencies make playing him very annoying and very difficult at times. And if you don't have these very strong add-ons, I feel like you might struggle otherwise with Pinhead. That being said, I think some of these things will probably be more consistent in the future patches, and we will likely see some of the nerfs happen to some of these stronger add-ons. I wouldn't be surprised. So overall, I think Pinhead is probably poised to remain around this place in the tier list. And next, we get to Demogorgon. Now, Demogorgon is a very well-rounded killer, in many ways an ideal killer with almost equal strengths and weaknesses. What are the weaknesses? The weaknesses of basically any average killer. He doesn't have an incredible threat of insta-downing. He doesn't have any crazy mobility, but he is somewhere in between. He can use his portals for mobility, he can use his portals for moderate chances to detect and stop survivors from doing certain objectives. His chase tool is pretty adequate. He will get hits on greedy survivors at pallets, loops, windows, if they allow it. Some of his very basic add-ons help a lot with this, with Barb's Glasses or Black Heart reducing his cooldown by 50% on successful hits or successful pallet breaks, which is really nice. So his base add-ons are pretty decent. With some of his other rare add-ons also being adequate, with one of his iridescents in particular standing out. The Lichen in particular gives quite a lot of information. So he's a very decent killer, very average. Problem with him, he doesn't particularly excel in any one area. If you happen to go to a difficult map filled with pallets, with survivors that use their exhaustion perks well, that do not necessarily fall into any obvious traps, that maybe even try to bait you and trick you a couple times, it can be hard to get your first down going quickly, and you don't have any insane ability to snowball through use of your power or to bring the game to a halt the way Pinhead, for example, can with his chain hunt. So it will ultimately come down to you being consistently really good at dealing with loops and having the survivors make a few mistakes, or maybe even bringing some perks that help you, like Set the Best for Last, if you can't even build it up, Devour Hope, Haunt the Ground, whatever it is that gives you a bit of an oomph. His decent mobility makes him not terrible at any one given map. He does have some little bit of stealth. Some loops are still painful to deal with. You don't have any add-on, unfortunately, that just makes him undefeatable by any stretch, and you are ultimately a somewhat predictable killer. But Demo, I think, is a killer that is just well-rounded all around, and I think he fills this niche quite well. He's good at breaking walls, he's good at breaking pallets. With some elevated areas, he can actually gain a bit of pocketed mobility, where he can shred from a hill or a building and close a gap really quickly. The really good demos understand that they can hit the edges of hitboxes and do incredibly ambitious predictions around pallets, around windows, and hit through the slightest margins, which is awesome. But yeah, ultimately, everything that's difficult for killers will be difficult for Demogorgon. Items that are really powerful, medkits that are really powerful, maps that are really rough and dense with pallets or strong structures will be hard, ultimately. So if you decide to play him despite all of this, I respect you. And next we have the Deathslinger. And Deathslinger is one of the killers that has the most things to say about him. Because he has been arguably the one that has received the biggest rework nerf in this update. So the Deathslinger could basically insta-shoot before, could aim down his sights and immediately send an incredibly fast projectile. It's not an insta hit scan, but it is very fast and basically impossible to avoid at close range, at least from reaction. He can no longer do this. So from being able to almost instantaneously hit a survivor at close range, or very fast hit a survivor at mid-range if they come to a stop, he now has to aim for at least 0.4 seconds before he can shoot. He has a faster speed while aiming down his sights, and after he cancels it, if he does, he has a 1 second of cooldown. This cooldown is not a big deal. A Deathslinger can still zone you out in the open and make you second guess yourself and ultimately down you or spear you in the open and catch you. The problem with The problem with the lack of insta hits is that many of the quick reactions that you could do before are now no longer possible, or at least significantly riskier and more difficult to pull off. So if you see a survivor go through a wall and you spot a little hole, before you could immediately shoot, catch a survivor and either injure or drag them around for a hit if you didn't want to break the chain. And that is now impossible. You will need to predict that the survivor will do that 0.4 seconds in advance, which makes some of these shots much harder. You will no longer be able to do a quick shot after a pallet, even if you're late, and then be able to drag them around for a hit. You will now need to be a lot more deliberate in your prediction if you want to get such nasty shots on survivors. On top of that, his terror radius went from 24 meters, which was very, very spooky with monitor and abuse, to the standard 32-meter terror radius. And he still moves at 110, so his speed hasn't changed, but his terror radius has. And it's hard to gauge how strong of a change this is for the survivors, but I'll do my best. If you have monitor and abuse, you basically reduce the time that survivors have to react by almost 2 seconds for a normal killer. So with a killer that was this sneaky with a music in his terror radius so quiet, this was pretty damn huge. You could catch a survivor, you could literally shoot a survivor that could not physically hear your terror radius, or that had just barely started to hear your terror radius. That should never ever happen anymore. Even with monitor and abuse, they do have a much bigger tell that you're coming. And this makes a lot of difference for a killer that has to react to what he's seeing ahead of time and get shots on unsuspecting survivors. So that whole playstyle is now going to be a lot more difficult. Injured survivors will be more careful. Healthy survivors with sprint bursts will prepare themselves, and you will not get anywhere near as many free hits that you could before with the new terror radius. I'm sure that if you played a bit of survivor yourself and you've played against a decent amount of Deathslingers, you can count very, very easily how many times you're on a generator, you hear the terror radius, you start moving, but now you're in a situation where the Deathslinger has a really good shot. Maybe he misses, maybe he doesn't, maybe half the times he catches you. That's one free health state that he got thanks to his small terror radius. That is no longer the case. So these are pretty big blows for Deathslinger. He is a killer that is good in the 1v1, but not as oppressive as before. That has the ability to make people mend, so that should help in the 1v4. But because he needs to reload and because he's not very mobile, it's hard to apply this mending to multiple survivors. If a survivor needs to mend, but you need to chase him, he can just keep running, and the mending is not really required. So that part of his kit is still a little bit awkward and not really easy to take advantage of. Now, there is one thing that the Deathslinger has had a net positive change in this update, and that is the recovery from breaking your spear. Breaking your spear used to take 4 seconds, and even with add-ons, it was still pretty bad. Now, breaking your spear takes only 3 seconds, the same as a normal attack cooldown, and with add-ons, it actually gets pretty damn fast. So you can break your chain against a survivor, and with a cigar and the tobacco, you can recover at save the best for last rate of fast. And that's pretty significant. These add-ons probably will be popular on him, and they do make it so that this killer has a pretty good first hit and then pressure on you for the second one. However, if you're using both of these add-ons, then you're not using the reload add-on. If you're not using the reload add-on, you still have a lengthy reload. If you want to choose some of the other more impactful add-ons, like the ones that makes mending take longer, or the insta-down one that has been buffed, these add-ons are just not as appealing because getting value out of them is situational and difficult. And any slot that you choose is an add-on that can no longer be reload, miss cooldown, or chain break recovery. So for that reason, I feel like no matter what you pick on this killer, you will have some weaknesses, and he will probably struggle to play at the level that he could before. If survivors now are capable of dead harding and reacting to close range shots because they see you bring up your weapon and they can physically react to that. That is only going to make his one real strength that he had before a little bit weaker. So overall, I think he's dropped down quite significantly. He's by no means a horrible killer. He's still a killer that you cannot easily vault a window, drop a pallet, or do anything stupid in front of. And he will still benefit from strong perks that were good on him before. He has good synergies with basic attack perks like Sedibus Volas, Sloppy Butcher, and so on. So he will still be a very, very decent killer, don't take me wrong. But one that has fallen from the top of the B tier some time ago. Next up, we have the Hillbilly. The Hillbilly has received some minor changes to his add-ons. Some of the least appealing add-ons have been reworked or readjusted. Overall, this change is positive. It makes some of his stronger add-ons, like the engravings, a little bit nicer. It basically relegates cooldown add-ons, overheat add-ons to a secondary place. A good Hillbilly could already manage his overheating. Now that the engravings don't add any additional heat compared to no engravings, you probably don't ever need the overheat add-ons anymore unless you're trying to learn Hillbilly or have some other idea. And some of his other add-ons that you could never use, like the Pighouse gloves, which were basically horrible, or what was it called? The black grease that was essentially useless. These add-ons now have a niche ability to them. So that means that the add-on range for Hillbilly has increased a little bit. Nothing crazy. So what remains on Hillbilly is a basic killer that can do anything a basic killer can, which is good. That has good mobility in an open area, which is awesome and useful, despite not being very stealthy with it, mind you. And that can insta-down survivors in the open. That can insta-down survivors in some loops if played right. And that can obviously shred through pallets and walls in unpredictable ways sometimes, especially with the low pro chains that are the real gem that Hillbilly still has in his kit. Because you can break through a pallet and still get a hit, and survivors need to play a little bit careful around that. So, you have a killer that is good at several things, but that is incredibly hard to play. Survivors that have a brain that play well will make windows a nightmare. That's why many Hillbillies bring Bamboozle. Will make playing around pallets difficult. Not only will you need to manage your overheating, you will need to charge perfectly, you will need to flick perfectly, you will need to not hit the edges of the obstacles perfectly, or else you have a very punishing stun. And then if you do that, all of that perfectly, you need to hope that the survivor didn't see it coming and just did a little sway movement to the right. Because if they do that, then you've done everything, but you still will miss. So compared to other killers like Cannibal or Nemesis that are really straightforward and you can play well and immediately add pressure, on Hillbilly, you don't need to play well. You need to play almost flawlessly or else risk losing everything and losing way too many things in chase. Luckily though, he does synergize quite well with information perks due to his mobility. He does synergize quite well with regression perks due to his powerful pressure tool. Anyone nearby cannot mess around too much or else they are susceptible to going down. The problem with Hillbilly is that not every map is really made for you. Indoor maps are often painful. Maps with many buildings, Batham, Haddonfield, some of the more heavy window heavy maps, they are really tough. Even Bamboozle will often not save you from the multiple windows or the multiple fences that kind of hinder your mobility and hinder your ability to get people killed. So unfortunately, for the amount of work that is required on Hillbilly, if you were to spend 1,000 hours on Hillbilly getting good at him, you would probably be able to do very comparable amount of damage with other killers higher in the tier list with much less investment and with way less precision. I'm pretty sure that a really good Bubba could probably, unfortunately, outperform a really good Billy with half their brain turned off, which is kind of sad the way it is. So these add-ons are a little bit gimmicky. Not too. A few of them are worth their weight, with most of them being gimmicky or just inferior picks. They don't bring up his power too much unless you really know what you're doing and you bring up a particular combination, such as low pro chains, such as the better engravings, and so on. And even those are still very, very difficult to use and very map dependent. So unfortunately, Hillbilly is this low. If you really are good with Hillbilly, true, you will probably wreck any team that has even a single weak point to them. But almost the same could be said for any killer above him. Hence, he is lower placement here, even though by any means he's still a decent killer with a considerable power to him. Next up is Trickster, and Trickster has climbed the spot since the last time very considerably. I think I placed him in the second spot to last, because Trickster was in a really, really bad spot before. But ever since, he's received quite the glow up, and he's quite good at many things. His add-ons also being reworked, and overall very, very good. He no longer needs 8 knives to down you, he now only needs 6. And he has add-ons to make his throw rate faster at the beginning. He has add-ons to reload a little bit quicker. He has an add-on to reload automatically. He has an add-on that allows him to insta-down survivors if you put 4 knives in them. This is not the most incredible add-on against really, really good survivors, but it makes average survivors die very fast. It makes you save knives a lot, and a survivor that just happens to be caught in a bad spot will go down immediately. So it is a really, really strong iridescent. So his range of add-ons, almost from brown to iridescent, is actually pretty decent and very, very good. The strengths of this killer are basically being able to inflict a ridiculous damage per second with very, very little, with quite a bit of room for error and not a lot of singular position required. Unlike Huntress, you don't need to make a precise read and understand the exact hitbox of any one survivor at any given time and wonder if they're going to crouch for a millisecond. You can actually just toss a lot of knives, and on a short loop, the survivor is going to eat 90% of them. Even if they try to dodge out of the way and make you miss some knives, they will still go down. A survivor in the open is eaten alive by this killer. And unlike other killers, like Demo, for example, or like Slinger, Slinger, for example, is a good candidate for this comparison. You don't hit a survivor and then need to reload or slow yourself down. You hit a survivor and you still are doing damage. So a survivor that you hit in the open that doesn't immediately get out of sight will receive 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe all 6 of the next knives. So a survivor that is badly positioned can be injured and then almost immediately injured again, or be left very close to the next injured, which will down them if they don't play it right. So he is very, very good at doing this. Obviously, if there's multiple survivors that try to body block, this also comes into play. Body blocking against this killer is largely futile. If he doesn't run out of knives, which sometimes it's hard to make him run out of knives, he will pelt anyone very, very quickly and get rid of health states really quickly. If there is borrowed time, he can put a knife, wait for the final knife, and outplay borrowed time. If there is someone fully healed, he can also go through health states really quick. The more knives he throws, the slower he becomes, but the faster the throw rate goes. And on top of that, he has main event. Main event has a fixed throw rate of 1 knife, basically 5 knives per second. So that really does mean that if you're in front of him and you don't move or you're stuck, he will down you in about 2 seconds. Give or take with the starting animation, right? So he can down survivors or injure survivors really fast. And even though the main event is a little bit hard to use, he does have he does have his moments where it comes in handy. So he's incredibly good at defending. If you come towards a killer like, say, Legion or Wraith, and they see you coming, they don't have any ranged ability. There's nothing they can do. This killer much like Huntress, can actually threaten survivors that are within sight. You can start to throw knives, which means that if they keep approaching, you will injure them, forcing survivors to keep their distance and keep their line of sight broken. So he's very good at defending. He's very good at catching survivors in the open. In low loops where his knives can go over obstacles, he's basically uncounterable, all of which is really, really strong. But now we get to the negatives. What are the negatives to this killer? Number one, he's 110. He cannot M1 consistently, making some perks a bad pick on him. He also doesn't get around long obstacles very fast because of his speed. And that means that a survivor's running you around tall obstacles like, say, shack, long jungle gyms. You cannot deal with them very well. You put a couple knives, they go behind the wall, you stop slowing yourself down, you catch up, they go behind another wall, and at this point, they are winning. You cannot use your ability in such scenarios, and that is one of his biggest weaknesses. Even if you still manage to get downs, if you are not very efficient with your knives, you will feel how bad it is to have to reload. For a killer that doesn't have any crazy mobility, you do need to spend some time of your match looking and minding the lockers around you, making sure there's still lockers around you. In some maps it can be hard to make sure that you can reload and not be out of ammo, because being out of ammo with this killer is obviously a really, really bad thing unless you are very, very lucky and you just happen to not need them. But yeah, you need to constantly mind that. You need to constantly reload. He does have a lullaby that is audible, not from too close. So it doesn't really impede his ability to use stealth perks. He can still use Tinkerer. He can still use Monitor. He can still use Dark Devotion, whatever. But he doesn't use it as effectively as other killers. His terror radius, even though it's small, is overlapping with this lullaby that will always warn survivors that you're coming. Now, because of your terror radius being kind of funny, survivors can hear it and ignore it, or hear it and misjudge it, but they will never be truly, truly caught off guard if they're paying attention because of this lullaby. And on top of that, you also have the cost opportunities sometimes of using your power, where yeah, you'll get a down, but now you'll have to reload quicker, or you'll trigger a main event in a time where you don't really want to use it, or you cannot use it. And that feels really bad, because you'll probably get 2 or 3 main events per game. And if 1 or 2 of them doesn't get to shine, it is a big, big shame. So overall, this killer performs really, really well in the matches where survivors are in the open, where you have a strong map that helps you out, or you play around it really well. He doesn't have a lot of crazy synergies with perks, but you can still make builds that work on him okay. But then if you go against competent survivors in a map like Batham, where you literally can never threaten a survivor from a distance because of all the fences, buildings, walls, and overlapping structures, you will have a really, really hard time. For that reason, because this killer is has such high highs and such low lows, it's real hard for me to play someone on a tier list. If I had to give it my best shot, it would be right here. We do have to assume, however, that his add-ons are pretty good, and he is pretty damn good at defending kills as well. So that's another thing that is in his favor, that does give him a bit of an edge over some of the other killers that we'll see in a minute. The next killer is Wraith, and depending on who you ask, Wraith is either the best killer in the game or the worst killer in the game, and there's almost no in between. The one thing that we have to consider going into this tier list for the next upcoming patch is that he's getting nerfed slightly. When coming out of cloaking, he has an amazing speed that lasts 1.25 seconds. I'm sure you've been hit by this, or you hit someone with it yourself. It gives him a massive lunge. Well, that lunge is being slightly shortened by 0.25 seconds. So from 1.25 to 1 second, he will not be able to hit as far, which means he is not quite as good at catching survivors in every imaginable loop when coming out of cloaking. So that's a minor nerf that will make a bit of a difference. On top of that, one of his better add-ons, the all-seeing blood, which allowed him to see survivors through structures from up to 12 meters, is now nerfed. This add-on is still useful when using it in chase, but you can no longer put it on and just move through the map at very high speed and see things around you. So with these nerfs in mind, what do we have left? We have a killer that has no terror radius, that has no indication to the survivors that he's there, unlike Plague or unlike Nemesis. The survivors will not see any props or items in the map that reveal the killer. So he has a very good chance to catch the survivors off guard at the start. Because he's so fast moving at 150 by default, he can cover even large maps really quickly, getting into the first chase very fast. Once you're done with the chase, your next chase typically takes very little to happen again because of his mobility and his ability to shed his terror radius. So the time between chases is very short. Unlike other killers, you don't need to reload. You don't need to wait for your power to recharge or anything like that. So those are great strengths with some add-ons adding to them. Some add-ons allow you to break stuff quicker, move even faster, get even more information. The range of add-ons overall on this killer are pretty solid, and while not entirely ultra OP game-changing stuff, it is quite good. And there's a lot of meaningful decisions that you can make with these add-ons, and they mess with other add-ons and perks quite well. So a lot of thought can be put into making these add-ons work really well. He also has great synergies with many perks that allow you to use the information very well, or make the insta-down really strong, or make healing hard with sloppy butcher nurses and so on. But now we get to his main weaknesses. What are the main weaknesses of the Wraith? That he has no other strengths other than what I just mentioned, basically. Once you are out of cloak, you are a basic killer without any notable ability to do anything else. If you get a grab on a survivor, awesome. If you get an ambush hit on a survivor and then they go down because they're out of position, brilliant. But other than those things, once you engage in a normal chase, you are a perfectly predictable, perfectly average, perfectly loopable, perfectly abusable killer. If a survivor has a flashlight and you get burned out of it, bad stuff. If you get stunned while in cloak, bad stuff. If a survivor abuses some of the tricks that you can do against Wraith to deny him of some of his power usages, not great. But even if they don't do any of that and they just loop you like a normal killer, it's hard. It's really, really hard to get down quickly. Survivors that play with stretch res or that are really smart and don't fall for obvious mind games, even if you get the first hit on them, they will not go down. And if they don't go down, your best bet is to ambush someone else. And if that person also doesn't go down easily, your best chance is to get everybody injured and hope for some chaos to ensue. And with the strong medkits, the strong toolboxes, the upcoming circle of healing perk being in play, that's going to become harder and harder and harder. So for that reason, if you play against very competent survivors, you have a really, really hard time. The rougher the map, the rougher you will feel the Wraith's weaknesses. Now that being said, why is he this high above other killers? That is a good question. Arguably, if you play against really, really smart survivors that are aware and call you out constantly and preemptively move to safety if they know you're coming, the Wraith can truly feel like the most useless killer in the game. But in actuality, that's not what happens. In actuality, when you go into a match, oftentimes you're playing against 4 survivors that are clueless, that are not paying attention, they're not on comms, or if they are on comms, they're talking about the last episode of whatever Netflix show they watched, and that helps you. Playing against survivors that are not paying the most attention and being able to constantly catch them in the open and easily getting a hit and easily going from one chase to another and easily stopping them on their first gen, as opposed to most other killers that can be stealthed against, that is really, really good. You go to a Haddonfield game with, let's say, Cannibal, and you find one survivor in a corner that hears your turtles and hides, you are set up. You're already set up for failure. You have 2 other survivors really, really far away. You will take another minute to find someone. When you find someone, they'll start to pre-drop pallets. That is a difficult place to recover from. You could also be playing a strong killer such as the Nurse and then end up going to a difficult map such as Larry's, where you're really out of your element and you're not doing so well. Meanwhile, with Wraith, you almost have an insurance. In almost any given map, you at least have a chance to catch the first few survivors off guard and to do something despite whatever map you might have been sent to. So I think that's very valuable, and I think that's really, really good. However, I do see his nerfs and the new playstyle of healing fast with perks and items hurting him a lot if you don't play him extremely well. Luckily, despite his simple mechanics, there is a lot of skill involved with Wraith. Positioning well, taking the extra second to come from a different angle to catch survivors off guard, understanding what survivors see and what they hear, how they cannot see you past 20 meters, how they don't always hear where you're coming from if you're running certain add-ons and so on. All of this has a considerable skill ceiling to it. And if you get good at Wraith, you'll have a very consistent killer that can do okay in most scenarios. A difficult one, regardless. Next up, we have the Doctor. The Doctor has some unique strengths, some unique weaknesses. Actually, no, I would say his weaknesses are pretty universal, but let's talk about his strengths. He can counter stealth, which is useful. Against new players, this is really, really strong. They do not do so well once you start chasing them, so hiding is very effective. You flush them out of hiding, you're already getting the upper hand. In higher MMR, do not expect survivors to be cowards. They will often welcome the chase. They will often lead you to a place where they know that you can be run around for a long time. So this part is not as important, but it's still good. It still has good synergies with many perks to know where survivors are and to bring them out of hiding. If you play against survivors with 3 medkits and you don't want to risk one of them using a styptic on you, you can put them in tier 3 with Madness, and they cannot use the item in chase, which is good. There's a lot of little things that Doctor can use that are not always super obvious and that all stack up in small ways. So that is great. There's also a very considerable skill ceiling to using his power well. You can do a lot of tricks where you fake a certain play and trick a survivor into dropping a pallet and then shock them on the other side of the pallet where they are now trapped and you can go for an easy hit. There's a lot of little things like that you can do that are very sneaky and that the average survivor will fall for time and time again. Now, unfortunately, even the average survivor will still outplay you by using common things such as latency. Unless you're running a specific add-on, shocking a survivor has a considerable delay to it, and your ability to stop the loops is dependent on that delay and the latency. Many times you will do a perfectly reasonable shock on a survivor that should prevent them from vaulting a window and giving you a hit, maybe an insta-down. But because they live in God knows where and they have God knows what Wi-Fi, they will vault the window. And that is incredibly annoying. It is something that is hard to gauge how often it will happen, but it's something that will happen to you. And it is quite annoying. Luckily, the Doctor does have many add-ons to bring to his kit. Many of them are unpredictable and hard to identify and outplay by the survivor. Most of them at least give him something. I don't think they are incredibly oppressive for survivors that are not new to the game. I think most of them are quite manageable for the survivors, but some of them really do some things that are useful. You can put a survivor in Madness tier 3, pretend to go away, and because they don't hear a terror radius or they hear a constant terror radius, you can come back and catch them and hit them from another angle. You can hit a survivor from very, very far, prevent an unhook, or prevent the pallet drop with the shorter detonation time using Discipline. There's a lot of little things that you can do, and I reckon that a really skilled Doctor can make this work very, very well. But as I said, even average survivors can still outplay you by doing the most basic things. Hogging really, really strong windows and pallets can be difficult for Doctor. Sometimes even a really good shock cannot really cover all of your bases. If you hit the survivor and they don't camp the pallet but instead link it with another pallet or another window, sometimes it can be hard. Even if you manage to get the hit, unlike Nemesis or unlike Cannibal, you don't get rid of the pallet. So it's possible that the survivor will later waste your time on this exact same place. So whereas Nemesis would get a down and get 3 pallets out of the way, with Doctor you might get a down and still have 3 pallets to deal with later, potentially. This is very annoying, especially when you consider Dead Hard to be one of the most common perks that you'll go up against. Survivors can Dead Hard through your blast to avoid screaming. Some people know how to do that. They can also Dead Hard through your shock, which is very, very annoying. Sometimes you'll be able to bait the first shock and do another one to hit them after the Death Heart, but if they're already past the pallet, it's not something you can honestly do much about if they know how to Death Heart well. If you play against 4 survivors that are good, that know how to Death Heart, you're going to feel that your Doctor power is very underwhelming at times and that they are largely in control. For that reason, I don't think his chase potential is like limitless. It's very much limited. It's very much still in the control of the survivors at times, and even the best Doctor cannot truly pressure multiple survivors from the get-go. You're not a force to be reckoned with any survivor near you has to really be mindful. They can take hits for each other. They can slowly avoid being built up. They can 99 their madness at tier 3 if they want to resist another blast and then finish it up. There's a lot of things they can do. Even survivors that are in madness tier 3 can still open gates. They can still get rescues. It's a really nice tool to have, but it's not something that will just win you games by itself. So yeah, you still have the ability to use many perks that are quite underrated, that are not really popular on other killers, to a large degree of success on Doctor, which is cute. And he works well on a variety of maps, but if I were to play Doctor against decent survivors and I knew that I went to a map like Batham, I would already be sweating. I would know that no matter what I do, I'm going to eat the pallets that I know are strong, that I'm never going to get a really good chance to pressure multiple of them at a time, and it's quite rough. Still, very, very high skill ceiling, fun, interesting, strong add-ons to bring. Don't be discouraged from playing Doctor. He's quite alright. And next we get to Legion. Now, Legion in the next patch could generally take a considerable leap. There is a new perk on Legion that I think is quite powerful. Blood Favor will work on Legion's attack. And with cooldown add-ons, Blood Favor could honestly spice up some of his already strong builds. So I'm going to keep an eye out to see how that works. I know that this perk will also be strong on other killers that we've mentioned, but I'm particularly interested in how Legion will deal with this. Even that consideration aside, what do we have on Legion? Very, very simple weakness, but a lot of layered, complex strengths. So Legion is basically able to make every survivor that he gets close to injured. Unless a survivor makes a play of the century and you misplay it a little bit, any survivor that you're close to will get injured. Sometimes if the survivors are not particularly smart, they will also get injured while dropping pallets, which is huge. There are many killers where if survivors pre-drop pallets, you eat dust. If you're playing Nemesis and they start pre-dropping pallets while you're in tier 1, that's rough. If you're playing Clown and they start pre-dropping pallets, Pig and they start pre-dropping pallets, that is rough. If you're Legion and they pre-drop pallets, more than welcome. Those pallets will actually be very, very critical later when they run out of them and they're all injured. So being able to injure survivors through windows, through pallets, consistently is very, very, very good. Once you injure them, they go into mending, which means that if you move on to someone else, that survivor needs to, they can do some things, but they will be slowed down, at least for a little bit, if they don't want to bleed out, right? And if you do continue to chase that survivor, being in mending also has some nice benefits to it. If they get adrenaline, they will not get the heal boost. If they have a medkit with a styptic or some other strong thing that they want to use in chase, they cannot use it in chase. So that's all really, 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 really nice. You can outplay many items like this, which is a nice benefit of Legion that is not always talked about. So that's great. You can get people injured really quickly. If they're close to each other, this can link up in very mean ways. If you have 3 survivors spawning in one area, you can get them all injured, especially with duration add-ons. This is largely unavoidable. Obviously, the play for the survivors is to split up and never give Legion the chance to get more than 2 or 3 hits at a time, or else they will suffer. But even if they do split up, you can still detect survivors with your ability. And if you don't make it to them, you can just cancel your ability and then get to them and then injure them and then start over again. There is a bit of a cooldown, but it's still something that is very much in your favor. The first phase of healthy to injured is one that Legion will typically always dominate in. The problem obviously now comes when survivors are all injured. When survivors are all injured, typically what's left to do for you is to cancel your power and then to start chasing them normally. And this is where, no matter what add-ons you have, you don't really have a lot of tools. Legion does have a nice range of add-ons, brown add-ons that are decent. He also has many, or they also have many useless ones, mind you, but at almost any rarity, at least 1 or 2 add-ons are decent and good picks. So you get as many people injured as possible, maybe you get some pallets out of the way in the process. Then you try to pick the weakest target and do normal M1 basic killer things to get them down. There's not too many tricks to playing Legion. There are some body blockings you can do, some little text you could do, but for the most part, especially without this blood favor perk that we've been talking about, you need to just get down to it and do some good mind games or brute force your way into a down. At that point, you have someone to hook, and ideally several people that are injured. They can heal, and as we've explained, healing in this update with medkits and perks can be very fast, but you also injure them again very fast. So if they heal, they are wasting a little bit of time, and if they don't heal, you have many people injured. They cannot go for rescues easily. If someone is dead on hook, you can constantly pogo stick off each survivor until you use Killer Instinct to find the one person that needs to be killed. Some of his add-ons are serviceable. You can break pallets with his strongest iridescent add-on and detect everyone across the map. He also has an add-on to detect the progress on generators, which frees up a perk for whatever devious build you have going on. He's got recovery add-ons, it's got duration add-ons, it's got add-ons to reduce the cooldown, which is helpful. Not a lot of love received for Legion in this update, but he still has many things going for him. Ultimately, it comes down to this question. Once you have everybody injured, or as many people injured as possible, can you get downs quickly? And if you minimize the time that it takes for you to get that down, and if you do a lot of damage with your initial injure, Legion is quite strong. You can down survivors that would otherwise be very competent with just one tiny little mind game. Unlike Doctor, where you might have a back and forth, hit, catch up, back and forth, hit, catch up. With Legion, you're going to injure them, you're going to catch up, you're going to slow yourself down, and from that point on, they have to play flawlessly while injured, which many survivors sometimes fail to do. So that is a great thing about him. Pulling off mind games with a short killer that's not particularly loud is a little bit easier than with some of the other big killers like Nemesis, who can be heard very, very clearly or seen very, very clearly in short loops, right? So he really has that going for him. The problem, of course, comes when survivors stay injured. They have a strong map, they use it well, they don't allow you to get multiple people injured. If by any chance you manage to get all of them injured, they understand that they don't need to panic. They don't waste 2 minutes healing everyone, they just heal 1, maybe 2 people. And that 1 or 2 people will be the person going for the rescue. And everybody else will stay on gens and be safe and play it super safe and not waste pallets and make each window difficult and make you regret not playing a stronger killer in chase. So that's ultimately what's going on with Legion. That's the strength, that's the weakness that bottlenecks all of their strengths. But they are still very, very capable, and I think for many people very, very fun to play. So if they ever get some quality of life changes or their add-ons are a little bit more fun, I'm sure many people would welcome it. Next up, we have Ghostface. Much like Wraith, Ghostface has no telltale, no indicator that he is Ghostface at the start of the match. Unlike Pig, unlike even Myers with his musical cue, you do not give off any clue that you're playing Ghostface, and that is one of your greatest assets. If this was a tournament and the survivors were aware of your killer, that would be bad, but they do not know that. You can often, with perks or with intuition, find multiple survivors grouped up on a generator and either get a grab, insta-down one of them, or set up multiple insta-downs for later by 99ing your stock. In this next update, Ghostface hasn't really changed. They've made some of his add-ons that were really, really necessary now partially base kit. So that basically means that if you play him without add-ons, he is better, but if you play him with add-ons, he's basically the same. So he's just a tiny little bit better than before. I don't think he has really moved much in the tier list, although he is obviously more pleasant if you don't want to use add-ons. Some of his strongest add-ons combinations now make a bit more sense. And if you want to try some of the more strange add-ons, even though there's not a lot to pick from, his add-on range is quite bad. It's now a little bit more possible. So using things like the iridescent outdoor security camera is now more of an idea, along with the pen, for example. So he doesn't have any crazy abilities. You will never play against a Ghostface and be like, oh, it's another Ghostface with this add-on, like you do with Blight, for example. So he's quite mild in his kit, but he's got a lot of things going for him if you manage not to make enough mistakes and you play it well. So at the start, you have the potential, unlike many other stealth killers, to really cripple a team by getting an insta-down and setting up insta-downs later that are unpredictable. And then later throughout the match, if you use your 99 in Ride, you can put teams in situations where they need to play very, very smart. They send the wrong person to go into the basement for a rescue because they were already pre-stocked, or they make the wrong play, and now you have 2 people in the basement. And on a killer that can insta-down, that doesn't have anything particularly strong to use in chase, other than the crouching and the minor stealth that comes from removing the red stain, but that can insta-down regardless. So it's a killer that uses stealth perks well. By virtue of his stealth, he can get really close to a survivor before they are aware. He doesn't have any noise that gives him away super early, like say Trickster with his lullaby. So that's awesome. He can use perks like Nurse's Calling, like Surveillance, whatever info perks to a great effect. And he can also have very strong starts in maps that are typically not good. Now, if you play a killer that immediately finds a survivor, gets into chase, and starts eating pallets in a big map with a lot of pallets with no mobility, that is horrible. So if you were to play Clown on a Mother's Dwelling, that could be devastating to see survivors just start to breed up pallets despite whatever you can do. Meanwhile, even though this killer could have a similar issue, they always, as a Ghostface, you always have the potential to have such a good start that even the map that you're in could turn against the survivors. Even a Haddonfield, which is not good for you, can still be good if you manage to lean and get someone from a window, if you manage to lean from some fence and get 2 or 3 people nearly stalked. All of those things, walls and stuff that hurt other killers, can actually be beneficial for Ghostface. So he is a little bit more comfortable in maps that the average killer would struggle, which is always a bonus. Ultimately, though, what happens when you play against a survivor team that is well aware, that is not immediately caught off guard, or that recovers really well from it? This killer is really hard. This killer is really, really hard. Any mistake you make is going to result in you being exposed. Someone from the hook can expose you. Someone from the ground can expose you. If we're going to get there, people with stretch resolution can expose you from places that you can't even see over. And ultimately, if you do not ambush someone, you need to chase them down, and this killer just doesn't have any crazy tools to chase people down. If you play on something horrible and open, such as the Fractor Cowshed, you're gonna dread every pallet. It's so bad that some Ghostfaces that are really adept at playing him decide to run Play With Your Food. And that is an interesting pick, because you just harass the obsession a little bit and then start insta-downing other people by brute forcing your speed into chases that they think they can win. So you do have some tools, even against really good survivors, even against odds that are not in your favor. You do have some tools to make his insta-down potentially really, really strong. Ultimately, though, you need to play very, very well. His best add-ons are average at best. Even though some maps are really, really good for you, most of them are not. In fact, his best map, Hawkins, is going away soon, unfortunately. So you do have a killer that's very, that can be very mediocre, that doesn't have many strong nuclear options. That's how I would feel about him. That being said, he does have a considerable skill ceiling to him. There are a lot of spots that you can learn to make many maps turn from bad to great opportunities. If you study the maps, you can find spots where you can stalk people in gens. Hopefully people that don't have Spine Chill or many other perks that will get in your way as a Ghostface. But as I said, he does have a considerable skill ceiling to him, so do not be discouraged from trying them out, or any of the killers that come that come after him, because they're still fun and you can still do really, really well with them. Next up is the Nightmare, and he is a killer that has dropped so dramatically. You almost have to wonder if I am wrong now or if I was wrong then. Still, the Cannibal. He used to be one of the weaker killers in the game. Almost everyone considered him to be bottom tier. Then he got a rework that made him very, very hard to stop. He had the ability to teleport. He could ignore borrowed time. He had add-ons to slow down the game that could stack on top of perks to slow down the game. That would stack on top of other perks. It was quite the noob stomper and quite the strong killer, even at higher levels. But a lot has happened since then. His range of add-ons is now very pathetic. He has an ultra rare add-on that makes everyone fall asleep automatically and makes them have a harder time waking up. This makes you teleport considerably quicker and allows you to use your power in chase a lot more. But other than this add-on, almost everything else is a pathetic pick. His add-on choices beyond this are really, really bad. He only has 5 snares now, so you cannot pre-place snares around the map. He only has 7 pallets, as opposed to, I believe, 10 that he had before. He slows himself down while placing these, so you need to be a bit more mindful when placing the snares. And either way, you don't have any crazy tools anymore. Survivors that wake up from clocks now take 90 seconds to fall asleep, and during the first 30 seconds, they are protected, meaning that if you hit them, they will not fall asleep, and you will not be able to use your power. And his ability to teleport remains the one true power that Freddy has. The one true power that Freddy has is his ability to teleport and exert pressure through his perks across the map, no matter what decisions you make. So you chase a survivor to a corner of the map with other killers, that would be really bad. With Freddy, you hook them there, they now take a long time to get there, you teleport all the way across to the gen that you see with Tinkerer, with Rhythm Tremors, with Barbecue, whatever. And then you use Pop, or you use Ruin, or you use one of these really strong perks to slow down the game. And that's the real strength of Freddy. If you take these perks away, Freddy crumbles. He is really, really bad. He doesn't have a power to use immediately at the start without his Iridescent add-on, because people are not asleep. You can play around his lack of powers and delay him a lot. And if he doesn't have it down, he doesn't really get to use the rest of his powers as much. Still, the thing that he has going for him is that with perks, you can delay survivors enough to make the gens not pop immediately, to make the first down happen, and to then pressure the gens no matter where you are with your teleport. So perks like Tinkerer, Thrilling Tremors, Popus, the Wizard, Ruin, all are very strong and all work really, really well on him. But if you play him enough, you'll realize that for how good you need to play Freddy and for how predictable he is, other killers around this position in the tier list would get that and more value out of him. He doesn't have add-ons to slow down the game anymore. So if you bring Pop and struggle to get the first down, which you will sometimes, that's not going to be as strong. If you bring Ruin but it is gone, that will probably hurt quite a bit. Large maps are still a little bit painful. He can deal with them better than some of the other average killers, but they are still really, really hard to get things rolling. Ultimately, when it comes to pallets and snares, pallets are better noob stompers, but in many maps they don't work super well because all of the pallets that could be there are already there. So unless you've already broken 6 pallets, you cannot realistically place them anywhere because they're just there's just no empty spots for pallets that are not already occupied, and I'm sure you know which maps I'm talking about. So you don't have a really, really strong starting power with the pallets. As for the snares, they are definitely useful in chase, but much like Clown, which we'll get to, they just force survivors to be a little bit greedy and take strong windows and drop pallets early. And guess what? They can do that because many maps have an abundance of strong windows next to strong pallets, and they will not necessarily miss those pallets because they'll find others. Or by the time you get rid of the pallets, the gens will have popped. So even though this killer is definitely good at stomping noobs still and allowing you to make a lot of bad decisions without taking into account the state of the gens. You will struggle a lot more against the higher MR survivors that will use the clocks to wake up, that will use chase perks against you, that will use strong items against you. I feel like you're gonna feel that a lot more on Freddy, and he's nowhere near as powerful as he used to be. That being said, you can make the argument that his synergy with strong perks is enough to make him worth it, and maybe slightly better than some of the other killers around him. I would respectfully disagree, but I might be swayed. You might change my opinion. That's all I have to say about him. There are some other factors, like the fact that when survivors are asleep, that they'll hear you. They won't hear your turret radius, so he does have some minor stealth built into him. The trick of teleporting to a generator and then approaching a survivor mid-chase from another angle still works a lot, even though survivors should be smarter than that and they should hear the noise. Ultimately, I think it will come down to how smart the survivors are when you play that you're playing against. If you are playing against good survivors, I think Freddy should be quite the struggle. Hence one of his hence his placement being this low on the tier list. Next up is Clown. And Clown honestly used to be legitimately one of the worst killers in the game. He had a very simple kit with a lot of complexity to some of his throws that was nullified by the fact that he was slowed down when he threw a bottle himself. His reload was 5 seconds long. Lots of horrible things made this average killer even worse. Now he is reformed. He has a yellow bottle that gives him speed. You do not use this speed, by the way, as a map control thing. The speed that you get from the bottle is comparatively very, very minuscule to the speed that other killers get from using their power. So you don't use the speed to go around the map and pressure gens or anything like that. The speed is a complement that you add on top of the slowdown in loops. And in that, the Clown is actually pretty damn good. If you throw a good bottle, a survivor almost always takes a hit in a loop unless a strong pallet unless they are at an amazing window that you need to play around differently, or unless they drop a really good pallet almost immediately. So a good bottle almost always cuts down a loop significantly. A good purple bottle with a backup yellow bottle is almost uncountable. Even a good dead hard or the best possible dead hard will still get the survivor hit if you use both. So a strong pallet, such as the straight pallets that spawn in farm maps, that survivors will typically run you around a couple times with an average killer and then drop, become death traps with Clown. And if Clown has lethality perks, which is what he lacks in his kit, if the Clown has lethality perks, such as non-lethal pursuer, funnily enough, say the best for last, or hunt the ground, anything to end down, it makes his power very, very, very scary. Survivors need to play really, really smart if they want to avoid this. On top of that, he's got add-ons to actually support him quite a bit. Not all of his add-ons are super good, and many of them are a bit of a dud, but he has strong add-ons almost throughout. His iridescent pinky finger is actually really, really, really strong. Difficult to use against good survivors, but very, very capable of turning things around immediately. And also has combines really well with extra bottles. The extra bottles, the faster reload, the slower effect of the slowdown, the longer lingering speed, the ability to see survivors' auras when you intoxicate them, or the ability to see their auras when you invigorate yourself. All of those add-ons are actually very, very decent, and in the hands of a capable Clown are quite scary. The problem with Clown ultimately comes down to map balance and item balance. Despite all the things that I've said, the map is something that the Clown needs to mind a lot. If the generators are really far and spread out, nothing you can do about that with Clown. You will need to be incredibly fast with your chases. You will need to be incredibly efficient with every single action you do, or that spread is just going to murder you. If you have a map with very, very many strong pallets and very many strong windows, survivors that are smart will abuse them. You will get rid of pallets quicker than other killers, yes, but you will still need to go through them. and the gens may be flying. Even survivors that do not get the full use out of their Death Heart or out of their Spin Burst will still make your power sometimes obsolete thanks to that. So survivors that play safe don't have a lot to worry about against Clown. And ultimately, as a Clown, you highly depend on your perks to help you out. If your Say the Best for Last gets enough stacks early, if your Hunt the Ground comes in clutch, if your Ruin and Dying slow down the survivors enough, then you can win. If your perks fail and they bring strong medkits, strong items, strong perks themselves, your odds of success greatly diminish. Even though you can do a lot of cute plays with yellow bottles that will catch cocky and average survivors way off guard, there's also chances for smart survivors to completely outplay you by identifying that you're trying to set up a yellow bottle play and just running and just going away and just holding forward. So you're a killer that needs to be very mindful of his actions, that has to reload, that can be punished for making mistakes, that does not have any ability to immediately shred through palace or immediately get insta-downs without a particular add-on that is quite strong otherwise. So you're a killer that's still very much susceptible to every little bit of BS that the game can throw at you. Otherwise, though, strong killer with quite a bit of presence in chase, with a very high skill ceiling, the seemingly high skill ceiling, that has some fun add-ons and some fun cosmetics so you can look like a chicken. So that alone makes him S tier in my heart, even though he's probably one of the weaker killers right now. That being said, he does have some things in chase, which other killers can honestly not even say. So take it for what it's worth, I suppose. Next up, we have the pig, who has undergone a significant amount of changes in the next update. If I had to summarize her changes, her base kit is identical as far as I remember, with only changes to her add-ons. Now, her add-ons used to be wildly inconsistent. She had add-ons that were complete garbage and barely usable, that never saw any use, and then she had a few add-ons that were maybe perhaps even overtuned and downright unfair. You had add-ons that allowed the killer to basically throw a dice and make the survivors die 1 in every 4, 1 in every 5 times, making it in some maps impossible to get 5 searches or 4 searches with some add-ons, and making the survivors die to her reverse bird traps. I would say that these add-ons are mostly neutered. The slowdown add-ons that made the head pops happen are mostly, in my opinion, gone. From my test, this playstyle should be a lot weaker, and I'm not going to say downright impossible. It can still happen, but much, much harder. That's a good thing. That means that the pig now has more room for her actual skill and her other slowdown add-ons. And even though this head popping strategy is less viable, almost everything else about the pig is much better. She now has some decent browns like she used to, some decent yellows, one of which is very promising and allows her to be slower with her charge, but also cover a larger distance with her ambush. That is good. That means that survivors can no longer turn their brain off. They actually need to think at loops on which add-on the killer is running and act accordingly. I love that. If that add-on gets some love, I think it will be really strong. She's got decent utility greens, some interesting purples that add to her slowdown. And all of that is wonderful. She also gets some interesting iridescent add-ons, one of which is really, really powerful, allows everyone to start off with a bear trap, which makes her early game really scary for survivors, since all of them start with a bear trap on their head. Love it. So she's just a more consistent killer than before. What is the big deal? The big deal is that her stealth is slow, unlike Ghostface, unlike Wraith in particular. You cannot act on information perks or just roam around the map until you find someone. She is very, very, very slow in her stealth, although there's one add-on that now makes her a bit better. So she's not a particularly great stealth killer. Her ambush, which can be used in chase, is not a particularly oppressive chase tool either. So she is perhaps one of the few killers where using your ambush in chase, unless you're in the right spot, is detrimental. almost every other killer that has a chasing power needs to use it consistently around the map, with some caveats, of course. You don't want to be throwing hatchets in a place where there's no line of sight. You don't want to be using your chain spinhead in every single place, but for the most part, you want to constantly use it. Unfortunately, the pig has an ambush chasing power that is hard to utilize and hard to get value out of in many, many maps, in many, many situations. Especially if the survivors are smart and they don't allow you to use it. If a survivor is not very smart, they let you get to the pallet, they'll try to loop the pallet, and then you'll hit them with your power. If they're smart, they'll just pre-drop the pallet, and that's the end of that. Now you break the pallet, they get you to the next one, rinse, repeat, 3 gems gone. Alternatively, they can also just pretend to do that and then run away, and then you'll have to uncrouch, and the uncrouching takes a second and 1.3 seconds, unless you have this brown add-on, and then you need to ring the add-on if you want to. It gets complicated. So you need to make a decision on which add-ons you'll be bringing. Some of the add-ons to slow down the game are now quite formidable. You get 5 traps to place on survivors to slow them down, potentially even kill them, which they need to mind. And these traps have side effects. One of them in particular is really nice. It allows you to see the aura of a generator if a survivor is working on it, which is awesome. The problem, of course, is the bottlenecking that her lack of chasing power imposes. And what I mean by this, I'm sorry, I might have worded it a bit weird, is that if you do not get downs, you cannot slow down the game. Again, without the iridescent add-on. So that means that if you chase 1 or 2 survivors at the start that pre-drop every pallet, that use every tool and every trick in the book to make the first down not happen, you might lose 2 or 3 generators before you even begin to slow them down. This, in tournaments or against incredibly solid survivors, is super crippling and makes the pig very, very weak. Luckily for you, most survivors in most matches, despite any MMR level you might have, are not in the right mindset. Even if they see that it's a pig, and even if they see the jigsaw boxes at the start, they do not play to the standard where you're never going to down them, ever. It might be difficult, but much like Oni, against the average team, even at high MMR, you will probably get a hit, you will probably get a down, and then hopefully you get things started. And if you do that, then Pig, especially with add-ons, becomes a consistent slowdown on top of slowdown from your perks. And if you're decent in chase, use her ambush to the best of your ability and mix it up with some normal, smart M1 killer basic mind games, then you're probably fine. Unfortunately though, you'll find that many maps are horrible to play because the pallets are really strong, they can be pre-dropped everywhere, and you don't get to use the full extent of your power, which is what makes playing Pig a little bit sad. So even though she is comparatively weaker because of her ambush not being all that strong in chase, she's still fun. You should still give it a shot. Next up is Trapper, who has also undergone a considerable amount of changes, mostly to his add-ons. He now has a base kit of starting with 2 traps. And much like Ghostface, this doesn't really make him immediately stronger. It just makes him better if you play him without add-ons. However, unlike Ghostface, Trapper does have other good add-ons. So before, with Ghostface, you had to use Recovery, and now you don't have to as much, but you have nothing else. Now with Trapper, you had to use bags. Now you don't need to use a bag. And those 2 add-on slots can actually be used on something else. His add-ons are not necessarily straightforward. They don't give you consistent, insane value. Almost all of his add-ons are situational and niche dependent. You might have add-ons like the Bloody Coil that work really well if the survivors disarm your traps, but don't do anything if they don't. You have add-ons that can catch a survivor and prevent them from escaping, like the Honing Stone, which work really well if you set up random traps and they step on those random traps, but doesn't work if you just set up traps to use mid-chase. You have add-ons to inflict Mangled or Deep Wound, which can be okay if they get caught in a trap and you don't catch them for a while, for example. So you never have a solid set of add-ons that is always useful and so always super impressive, but you do have better add-ons. And the little tricks that you can do with some of them are now a little bit more unpredictable than before. If you have the Bloody Coil that injures survivors, that doesn't warn them anymore with a red bar. That's good. If you run the oily coil that lets you see the aura of the survivor that is on the trap, you can use that against them, and they might not realize that you have that, which is awesome. So his atoms are a lot more interesting, a lot more useful. The ability to mix them is a lot higher, but ultimately, you still have a killer that needs to pick up his power from the ground, not as much as before, but still, that needs to pick up traps. You had to pick up, you had 4 to 6 traps before, and sometimes that meant that you could spawn in some maps with very few traps unless you had add-ons. So that luckily has been fixed. It's not a huge deal, but now you do have more consistent amount of traps, which is good. But you still have to pick them up, and they can still spawn in a building, they can still spawn on a hill facing away, they can still require a lot of time. And that is a time that most killers cannot afford, and the Trapper himself is no exception. Picking up a lot of your traps and setting them down requires a lot of forethought, requires incredibly deep knowledge of the map, requires great anticipation of where the chases will take place. You can waste your time a lot for little to no value, or if your traps are lucky, you can win the game with just a couple of lucky snaps. So this is a killer that will provide very inconsistent results due to the nature of his power. That being said, he can trap the exit gates, securing 4 kills more often than other killers, which is awesome. He does have great synergies with some perks that allow him to snowball really quickly and to build up pressure very, very quickly after something goes wrong, which is great. And then we get to the new add-on called the Trapper Sack, which is a purple add-on that makes him start with all of his traps. And this add-on is actually quite interesting. It's perhaps the most wild card and perhaps even the strongest add-on he has right now. I see it as the most consistent add-on out of his bunch, because instead of spawning with 2 traps, you spawn with all of them. You cannot replace these traps, but this add-on makes you better at what Trapper is already really good at, which is the lockdown style. You put a survivor inside the basement, and now you trap every living hole into that basement. And that is really nasty. And if a team falls for this, it's almost always a GG if it's early on in the match. Or at least it will secure you several kills, even if one of them gets out. So this playstyle of locking down buildings and locking down areas is now stronger than before, especially with this add-on. It's one of the more consistent aspects to play Trapper, which is something that you can always rely on, that you can trap a basement and put a bunch of bear traps on every opening, and that's typically hard for survivors to play around. You now have more tools to make it difficult. However, let's get back to some of his weaknesses. Survivors can still dead hard through your traps. Survivors that are smart can still disarm your traps if they see you put them down. If you're playing against a team, survivors can find your traps with maps. They can see you put them down and call them out. And certain traps, if you know they're there, you don't need to disarm them. If I see a trapper put a trap in the middle of nowhere, a really smart trap, I will just tell my team about it. And I'll tell them to avoid that specific trap. The trapper will not know that I've seen him. He will keep believing that that trap will get any use, and he will ignore it, and he will have wasted a lot of time, and he will have no clue. So survivor feds and strong coordination, holding a trap open for someone else to go through, all of those things still hurt Trapper. Big maps where you have a hard time picking up all of your traps, and survivors have an easy time establishing which areas are safe to run back to. Overall, every strong perk that works well against the generic killers works well against Trapper. So you are countered by the meta of sorts that this game has. If a survivor is injured and they step on a trap, and then they step on another trap, and then they're still injured. There's no baseline slowdown or anything like that. There's no real penalty for stepping on a trap. If you're already injured, you can be rescued still very quickly from other survivors. So he is a killer that has a power that can backfire still rather easily. A little bit more consistent. It is entirely possible that if I play him enough and I understand how consistent his Trapper Sack is, which is a single purple add-on, that I could change my mind and place him higher. But the way I see it, Trapper still has to catch up to survivors and starts the game considerably lagging behind other killers that can immediately pressure survivors off gens. With Trapper, it is a bit of a gamble that hopefully turns out right, but a gamble nonetheless. And next we get to Michael, who can definitely relate. The shape, much like Trapper, starts the game considerably behind survivors. Funnily enough, in this latest patch, he has been buffed. He is some of his more gimmicky add-ons are now a little bit stronger. One of his really good yellow add-ons is now a brown. So overall, from brown to iridescent, Michael has a great selection of add-ons, but he still has to go through the painful motions of how restrictive his tier 1 is. When Michael starts the game, he is considerably slower than the normal killer. He has no terror radius, but also has no lunge, and he is basically unable to keep up with survivors. You need to get to tier 2 to now be a normal movement speed killer with with some slight advantages. We'll get to that. But basically, you need to get out of tier 2. You need to get out of tier 1 as soon as possible. This alone is very, very bad. Very, very bad. With other killers, you are lucky if you catch 2 survivors on a generator and you can immediately one of them injured or even down, because that means that you're stopping that generator. With this killer, you are lucky to not even do that. You are lucky just to get out of tier 1. You will not get an early hit, potentially. You will not get an early pallet. You will not get an early down. It's really, really risky. If you try to go for a grab and it backfires, that could be very detrimental. So it's really, really risky unless you know what you're doing and the survivors are not paying attention. So you have a very, very slow game potentially. And after that, you're a killer that is slightly faster at vaulting in tier 2 and tier 3. You're a killer that has the most basic characteristics of it, despite having a slightly smaller terror radius, which is not that huge of a deal on most of the maps, even though it can be okay in some. So how do you deal with that? You need to have perks that really slow down the game, that really pressure survivors to do well, and there are very few of them that help do that consistently. And you need to hope that survivors make all of the wrong decisions and that you get your stock as quickly as humanly possible. You will have survivors run through you when you're trying to stalk them, which can be mitigated. True. You will have survivors pre-drop pallets and play really, really safe if you're threatening to use tier 3. And while some of the add-ons are honestly quite strong, with the tombstone piece in particular being quite busted, if you don't really use and abuse these really, really well, Michael is just a really, really average killer. Mostly predictable, can be looped even at his strongest, requires perks to slow down the game, starts at a net negative at the beginning. His tier 3 has a slightly bigger lunge, which is helpful but not absolutely game-changing, considering other killers like Nemesis, or killers with built-in insta-down that can hit on almost that can hit from almost any angle, or that can quickly down you without any prerequisites, without building up anything. So yeah, I feel like perhaps, especially due to his early game being tough, Michael is perhaps the weaker killer of the cast right now. And if you think that that's outrageous, if you think that Michael is definitely not the weakest, then you probably agree that he's not necessarily too weak. You can still have a good early game where you get out of tier 1 very quickly, maybe with the help of the decent add-ons that he has to stalk faster. And then you make use of his little subtle tier 2 advantages, the faster vault, maybe with or without bamboozle, the smaller terror radius, maybe with or without monitor, or the dead rabbit. You will use these small advantages to make it a little bit harder for survivors to know what to expect and hit what it hurts, maybe with the right perks at the right time. So Michael is by no means worthless, and in fact I think his add-ons really carry him at times, but I still think comparatively speaking he might just be the weakest. So if you think that he's not that weak, I agree. I think every killer in this list has many strengths, and it's hard to justify why they are low until you remember that other killers are just a tiny little bit stronger in some way. That being said, I believe that's almost all I have to say about Michael, and as a result, about every other killer. So I would really, really, really like if you remember all of the considerations and all of the rules that I explained for this tier list, and you gave me your own take or maybe your own rules as to and explain why you would place some of these killers differently. I know there will be some disagreements. I think it's really hard. Some of these I'm honestly not super sure myself, but this is the best I've been able to come up with. So thank you so much for watching if you watched all the way until the end. And even if not, I appreciate your time still. I'll see you in the next one.